Okay, well, welcome to everybody both here in the room and joining us now on the live stream to the 2022 Nest Insight Conference. I'm just going to start with a few bits of housekeeping. So we really do want this to be an interactive event. Whether you're at home or here with us at the Museum of London Docklands, you can put your questions to our panels using Slido, that's slido.com, and entering the hashtag NestInsight2022. We'll also have roving mics going around the room for the Q&A sessions for those of you who are here with us in person. You can join us on social media if you're so inclined. Again, we're using the same hashtag NestInsight2022. For those at home on the live stream, if you have any issues with the live stream, please email us at insight@nestcorporation.org.uk. We'll be monitoring that. We'll try and resolve that as best we can. We're also recording today's sessions, and they'll be available for people to watch back once we're done. Okay, I'm just going to introduce today with a few welcome remarks. I'd like to start with some thank yous. So first, I'd like to thank our strategic partners, BlackRock and Invesco, and their support is crucial to our whole work programme, including to events like today's, and we're hugely grateful to them for that support. All of Nest Insight's work is funded through external grants and sponsorship, and all of our work depends on partnerships of various kind, be those with our core funders, those funding individual projects, with our research collaborators such as the academic teams that we work with, and on delivery partners like the employers in our emergency savings trial and the fintechs that we're working with on our self-employed work. We are hugely grateful to all of them. We're always looking for more people to partner with across all those different types of partnerships. So if you or your organisation would like to work with us or thinks there may be ways that we could work together in the future, please come and find one of us here today or reach out to us after the event. I'd also just like to say a big thank you to my team, the Nest Insight team, my colleagues. It's a small team. These hybrid events are effectively like trying to run two events in one. They are a big effort, a huge undertaking. So firstly, please obviously bear with us if there are any glitches today. And of course, not only the team working on the event, but everyone in the background who works on the research, who works on developing those partnerships, contribute to the content that we'll be talking about today. So a huge thanks to them and acknowledgement for all the hard work that they do, for which I'm hugely grateful. Now on to the event proper. So we're really excited to be here today to continue the discussion about the issues facing low and moderate income households in building long-term financial security, and perhaps most importantly on the policy and market solutions which can help them to overcome those issues. We work hard with this event to bring together a real mix of policymakers, industry innovators, academics, researchers to try and get a real cross-sectional discussion going about these challenges and about those solutions. We really hope that they will generate a shared understanding and provide inspiration for those in the discussion about what more they could do to support these groups. So we're really grateful to many of you for being here in person today, and those of you who are joining us online, especially as we recognise that we're still working back through a transition towards live events and out of the COVID experience of the last couple of years. A little bit about today's agenda and the context in which today's event is taking place, and I don't mean the context a few miles down the river, although those of you who have been with Nest Insight from the start may remember that our very first conference happened 48 hours after the Brexit vote, so we are somewhat used to holding these events in times of, I think febrile is the official word, isn't it? Febrile political turmoil. Nonetheless, that is not what I'm talking about. For those of you who've been following the work of Nest Insight in the last few years, you'll know that over time we've stepped back to take an increasingly kind of wide-angled view of household finances. So we started out very much with research on traditional pensions-related topics. And over time we've come to think much more broadly about the conditions for long-term financial security and financial security in retirement, and in particular the interaction of those with shorter-term financial security issues. That's what's motivated our work on workplace emergency savings, which a lot of you will be familiar with. It's also what motivates our work on the interactions between retirement savings and debt, which we'll be publishing research on later this year. No doubt we'll touch on aspects of our emergency savings work today, but if you're wondering why there's no specific agenda session on that topic, I just wanted to highlight the really excellent event that we held a few weeks ago specifically on emergency savings. If you're interested to hear more about our work in that space, or indeed the work that many others are doing, and to hear some really great discussion on the whole topic of how to scale emergency savings solutions in future, then I'd recommend watching that event back. It is available on the Nest Insight website. Today we're going to be continuing that wider lens focus. So in recent months, the Work and Pension Select Committee, the ABI, the PLSA and others have all talked about the importance of increasing minimum pension contributions under automatic enrolment, and with a particular focus on increasing employer contributions. This morning we're going to explore the role of the employer in more depth. through research that we'll be publishing soon, which explores the current employer pensions contribution landscape and how employers' roles in supporting both pension savings specifically and financial well-being more generally might evolve into the future. And we'll try and locate that debate in the context of the current cost of living challenges and what this means for the priorities of both employers and of employees. For those in the room, we're then going to continue that discussion with a Chatham House session running into lunch. Then this afternoon, we're going to step out further still to talk about wealth building. Both pension saving and short-term saving can be located within a broader narrative about financial security, well-being, and wealth. So expanding access to pension saving through auto-enrollment has had a dramatic impact on participation in investment and capital markets by lower-income households. But how should we think about retirement wealth alongside other forms of wealth, and about the barriers that make building wealth difficult? Again, that discussion takes place against a backdrop of significant cost of living challenges for everybody, but especially for those on low and moderate incomes. We absolutely recognise that there's a growing debate about whether and how people can balance their short-term financial needs against those longer-term financial goals. One report this week suggested that as many as 1 in 10 people might have reduced their pension contributions as a result of changes in the cost of living. So we want today to involve a set of conversations that understand that reality and are rooted within it, but that remain ambitious about what we can do to improve the system for low and moderate income households and their ability to build financial security both in the short term and for the longer term. Whether those improvements are more immediately available or are things that may come into force later, hopefully once those current challenges have eased. Our view is it's really important not to take our eyes off these critical longer-term issues in spite of those shorter-term challenges. So with that in mind, we're really excited that closing the day today will be a keynote from the excellent Iona Bain, who many of you will know, and whose consumer-led focus on the real-world things that people can do to manage their money and build financial well-being will, I hope, provide a really great way of keeping us focused on the people in whose names we're having many of these discussions. We hope that those of you who are in the room still at that point will join us then afterwards for some drinks and nibbles. Okay, I think that's all from me for now. You'll see me again later. But for now, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Matthew Blackstad, who is Nest Insight's Director of Analysis and Governance, and who's going to moderate our first panel. Matthew.
Thanks so much, Will, and welcome again to this year's event. I think this is going to be a really interesting panel. For those who don't know me, my name is Matthew Blackstad. I'm, as Will says, Director of Analysis and Governance at Nest Insight. What that means is that my day job is mainly doing projects that involve looking at big data sets to try and understand a bit more about the dynamics of individual and household finance. But today, I guess I'm moderating a panel about the role of the employer. I'm slightly more casting back to my former life, which was working for large consultancies, helping employers put in place different kinds of benefits arrangements, pensions arrangements, and so on, and how to make sure they were well tailored to their workers. And that's really what we're here to talk about in this first panel, in a way, but actually more about the purpose of those sorts of programs. Because this panel is going to look at the role of employers, first of all, in maximising pensions outcomes for their workers, but also alongside that in what role they might play in the broader financial health of their workforce. We're going to explore the opportunities and challenges that are there for the employer in terms of how they might support workers in being financially well both today and in retirement. But because we're Nest Insight, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about pensions and auto-enrolment. Because the UK's auto-enrolment policy is rightly often cited as a really canonical example of a behavioural policy that's delivered on a really important national goal, in this case getting people to defer income into retirement. And as a result, because it's a behavioural policy, we often focus on the experience of the individual, the worker themselves, the person who's actually had automatic enrolment done to them. But by calling it automatic enrolment, we're sometimes ignoring the incredible amount of work that's been done by employers right across the nation to make it a success. And really, for me, one of the things the policy has most highlighted is the central and very successful role that employers can play in improving financial outcomes for their workers over and above just paying them, which might be where many people think it begins and ends. Things that employers did as part of automatic enrolment, obviously they automated through payroll the way in which a financial behaviour happens regularly on a drumbeat. They actually selected the product into which those flows of money go every week or every month. Because it's a law, they match contributions, and many do more than the law, as we'll hear very shortly from the research report we're presenting. And very often they go beyond this and provide guidance and support and other kinds of help for their workers. And all of these things, employers are uniquely position to do. And they're often, we find in research, they're often very highly trusted by workers to do things like this and to make choices on their behalf. And all of these things are very quietly in the background, not in the background for employers, but in the background in terms of policy, made automatic enrollment a huge success. And it's this role of the employer as the facilitator of financial health for their workers, which is the thing I think which is coming more and more into focus. Will's mentioned the recent push by the PLSA, the ABI and others, saying that a large part of any future pension contribution increases should come from the employer. But even without kind of policy push, right around the world, there are really great examples of employers doing really innovative things around things like pension contributions to encourage the maximum possible good outcome for their workers for each pound or dollar that's invested in employer contributions. And then, more broadly, we see a really wide movement towards thinking about the whole holistic financial health of the workforce. And many employers, I guess those employers we'd have to say who sort of appreciate the benefits of having a financially healthy workforce, which many, many do, and also those maybe who have the means to be able to deliver the sorts of programs that can help, which might be anything from that kind of guidance and education, right through to payroll programs for things like income smoothing or low-cost credit. There's a huge movement towards those sorts of things, but it's still quite localized, as we'll probably hear, among certain employers. So the question this raises is, what is the role of the employer in supporting their employees' financial security? And in what ways can they have the most impact? Because we're all working in constrained circumstances. And also, what are the barriers for employers doing this? And before I introduce our stellar panel over here, who are going to hopefully answer many or all of those questions for you, I'd just like to set the wider context for this conversation. And as Will mentioned, I do not mean the political context. We are steering well clear of that. But it's impossible to ignore the fact that we're standing here talking about financial well-being, financial security in really, really challenging times. And since my role at Nest Insight is all about data, I hope you'll be patient with me while I tell a little story through 4 graphs, but I promise it's only 4, and then you can hear people actually talking to you. So, first of all, you don't really need to see the dates on the scale there to guess what the spike here is in terms of the UK savings ratio. You know, we often rightly talk about the period of the COVID pandemic and the government measures and lockdowns as being a huge driver of financial crises, but we also know that it created a huge spike in terms of the overall household savings ratio, and these are recently published ONS data. And we can also see how quickly that fell off, however, when the pandemic came to an end. But of course, we're only looking here at averages, and we should be very, very careful when we're speaking about financial wellness of talking about averages. So if we also look at an excellent study done by the Bank of England last year, we can see how the increases in savings are distributed very, very unevenly between different groups. And specifically, you see that where it says savings decrease, the bigger red bars here, we're talking about those who are unemployed and furloughed, of course, but also those who are low-income employed. And one of the things we see in Nest when we look at our pay data that comes in from employers during the pandemic is how much week-on-week or month-on-month income for many, many workers just plummeted during the periods of lockdown. So this is obviously a very uneven picture, and there are some people who are feeling the pinch much more, for whom savings, even before the cost of living crisis began, was something of a challenge anyway. We also, though, need to think about the position of employers. We're going to try and take a very balanced view in this discussion about what the employer's position is and what the employee's position is. And for employers, this graph here, again, it's an ONS chart. It basically shows from a sort of starting position of 100% over on the left, over the period from the turn of the millennium, how the wage cost of employing someone has increased on average, and also how the non-wage cost has increased. And you can see the top line there, the darker line, is the non-wage cost, which has been racing ahead. So that if you like, the inflation in terms of things like national insurance and deductions has raced ahead much higher. It's often called the wedge because it's sort of shaped like a wedge. The bit that employers are watching kind of increase that cost. So every pound they pay a worker, they're paying just that little bit more every year. And there are things like national insurance spikes over there on the left and then up on the right. But there's also things like automatic enrollment built into that as well. These things sort of pile on each other. So we've got to recognize that context for employers as well. And of course, all of this is really only taking us up to the beginning of this year, all the data I've just shown you. And if instead we look from the sort of latter part of last year in terms of the opinions and lifestyle study that ONS do, this is asking households month on month has your cost of living increased, and I don't suppose it's any surprise to people to see how roughly around January that just started to climb. And it's not just that it went up, it's been going up every month. More and more people are saying every month that their cost of living is increasing every month. And so, of course, we have to be aware of that context. And of course, in that context, there's all the more demand for employers to ensure that they're keeping their workers in a good place financially, but also some real growing challenges to making that happen. So we need to talk about employee financial health during a crisis and during a cost of living situation, and also during a resurgent pandemic, let's be honest. But if we can, we also want to set our sights in this discussion beyond those immediate challenges to think about how the employer-employee relationship might be able to support financial wellness long into the future. And so, to address that very important topic, I have beside me here a panel of experts who are going to present 3 different perspectives on that question. But I do want to acknowledge, as I introduce them, that none of us up here actually represents an employer. We're really pleased actually to have several major employers represented in the room here who we really hope are going to participate in the discussion here. But just to say why we don't have any of them up here, one of the things that's really clear about this challenge is that when we talk about employers, we are talking about such a diverse range of employers in terms of size, sector, models of employment, many, many other characteristics. We didn't want to have, if you like, just one employer voice. What we've tried to do is choose people who can speak both for a range of different types of employer and also for their workers in this debate. And as we'll be doing through the presentation that Joe gives, we're also going to be sharing today the voices of over 500 employers who've contributed to a new piece of research and whose diverse perspectives we're going to be sharing today. So, with all that said, let me just introduce our speakers, and then I'll ask the first of them to stand up and give an initial presentation. Furthest on my right is Alicia Harrington-Clark, who's head of DC Master Trusts and Lifetime Savings at the PLSA, and as such is responsible for leading on a broad range of the PLSA's DC Master Trust and Lifetime Savings policy and advocacy. And Alicia was going to speak a little bit about the position of the employer and where employers are at the moment. Next to her, Jack Jones is a pensions policy officer in the TUC's Economic and Social Affairs Department. And before that, he worked as a financial journalist. And Jack is going to then try and tell the story a little bit more from the position of the worker. And then following that, Joe Phillips, our own Director of Research and Innovation, is going to present this new piece of research that we've done about employer pension contributions, kindly supported by the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust. So, let me stop talking and hand over to this very distinguished panel of speakers, starting with Alicia.
Hello, everybody. As I have taken to saying when I come to these things now, it's lovely to see real humans, which sounds a bit spooky, I appreciate, but it's just nice to see real people, isn't it? So hello, lovely to see you all. For those of you that don't know me, I have somewhat of an awkward job title, DC Master Trust and Lifetime Savings. The easiest way to describe what that is, I just described that to someone earlier, is that if it's not DB and it's not local government, it's probably me or someone in my team. And many of you have probably spoken to some of my team members in the last couple of weeks or months, because why I'm here really today, I guess, is because we've been looking at pensions adequacy, again, in some detail, across our membership and also for the PLSA's sort of policy perspective. So much of what I'm going to say is very much emerging, and one of the reasons why I'm here is to hear lots and to learn lots about what everyone's perspectives are on this, because it's very much a live issue. I think the only other thing I would say is I'm going to try and give us a sort of opener of where we're all at and some of the big ticket theoretical issues. I'm secret, I'm not actually really a policy person. I'm a policy person by stealth, and I'm not really a pensions person either. I'm also a pensions person by stealth. So I tend to have a bit of a inclination to go into sort of wistful theoretical spaces, so apologies for that in advance, and you can sort of bring me back to earth with questions. So what am I going to speak about? First of all, I'm going to talk to you about the puzzle, okay? So really, the landscape and contributions space I see as a bit of a puzzle. There are multiple components to this. I've picked a few, but there are others. And I'm going to start at the top, or you could say I could start at the bottom, and the foundation for most people is the state pension. Now, we're in a space at the moment from a policy perspective where the state pension age has just been reviewed or is in the process of being reviewed. It's a periodic thing, it happens periodically anyway. And you may have noticed, or you may not have done, that the PLSA's position is not just on age but also on level. So one of the things that we think that would be really beneficial from a sort of financial security perspective is if we could protect future pensioners from poverty by increasing the state pension level. That obviously has implications for the age as well, and any changes should not disadvantage any particular group disproportionately. So there's a lot to think about, but I thought I would start with that piece of the puzzle first, from which I will speak from, so you're going to need to hold state pension in your heads from now on, if that makes any sense. The second bit, putting more in an attempt to not be sort of pensions jargony, putting more in, contributions really is what we're talking about here. As I think all of you will remember and know, the PLSA, as have many others, long held the position that contributions should increase. This is at least in a sort of couple of different ways. I'll talk about this in a second, but we think this is really important for the financial security of future pensioners again. So the state pension, number one, increased contributions, number two. And though we're going to need to take account of the needs now as well as in the future, and this is one of the reasons why we're looking at all of these issues now again. I think also one of the things that I would just mention as well is that we're obviously very supportive of the government's long-standing intention for LEL removal and reducing the age. And I sort of laughed because obviously we sort of don't really have a government anymore. But we're still supportive of the government's intent, and we don't believe that the government's intent will change. So that's, again, just a foundation. I'm starting with foundations, so just a foundation. One of the reasons why putting more in is so important, I think, is because when we think about automatic enrolment particularly, we're talking about, I guess, the sort of new bog standard, the new average, and I'll come back to that idea in a bit as well. Goals and targets. Many of you will know that the PLSA have been supportive of the idea of goals and targets for a while. This includes the retirement living standards, one of the reasons why I've avoided putting them up is because I always end up putting them up. They are essentially intended to help people understand, plan, and engage with their future. That's the pure purpose of them. And as you know, rules of thumb only go as far as a rule of thumb, so I've resisted putting them up. But what we do is we support the work of all employers and all schemes that want to. They're free to use, free, open source, and we'll support anyone that wants to use them. They now have a massive usage, and we're doing quite a lot of work to understand what the impact that is having on sort of real people. So that's a sort of standard of living type point. And then getting more out. One of the things that was already mentioned actually was sort of defaults and if they are good value and how good value can be achieved. I think we'll probably come back to that theme quite a few times, so I won't dwell on it. But I just will also note that what you get out is also about accumulation, and often we're focused on accumulation debate when we're talking about automatic enrolment. But the PLSA perspective is very much that all of this is connected, and so without having you can't talk about accumulation without talking about decumulation. And so we have quite a specific decumulation policy that looks at improving the support at and in retirement that people receive. I think the next thing I'll just point out is my pig slide. So I think automatic enrolment is such a flagship sort of policy, already mentioned again, flagship policy. But I think one of the things that we need to consider is, as the slide says, there really is no good time to increase contributions. There's always going to be a reason not to do so. And financial resilience is a very individualised or household level consideration. And one of the things we're doing this year is trying to undertake some research to model some of the impacts of different policy changes on different individuals and households. I don't have any of the findings yet, but watch this space, because we're hoping that we'll be able to release that before the end of this year. And hopefully that will help us to take account of some of the specific factors for the specific individual sort of groups of people that are often of very great concern within the pensions industry. So under pension groups just generally, but I've also listed the self-employed, the lower paid. Again, they've already come up. And I think for low income groups and under pension groups, we're really going beyond now. We're trying to think beyond just increasing contributions. And that's not just a cost of living crisis thing. That's quite a long-standing consideration in the way that we've been thinking about pensions policy for the future. This is just a sweet dog. It was an excuse to put a dog up. Actually, the dog looks a bit miserable, which I only noticed really this morning. This slide is just to remind me to mention appetite. So I mentioned the state pension. Obviously, increasing the state pension, the appetite for that is yet to be tested, really. But also, since we're here to talk about employers and employees, I will get there in the end. Employees' appetite to save more, especially when we've just been talking about affordability, and sort of compounded by, as we know, myopic tendencies, etc., are likely to be really difficult to overcome. So just wanted to state that, because I think sometimes, again, I can get quite wistful, and I think we do need to be aware that obviously much of the sort of appetite for increases and changes have yet to be tested. This is one of the reasons why many of you have heard from me or my team recently, and one of the reasons why you continue to hear from us, because we want to talk about this more generally with everyone to understand what we can do about that. Who, what and when. So cost of living crisis, really how can we help people to balance their real-world financial well-being sort of now with their real-world financial well-being in the future, and how do we help them to do that, and who can help them to do that, and when can they be helped to do that. It was already mentioned that the PLSA's position is that we should be reaching 10% total contributions by 2030, and this is at least in part by levelling up the employer contribution, so increasing that by 2% so that everyone is matching the current employee contribution. And then increase both employer and employee contributions by a further 1% each, so that we're ending up with a 50-50 split in the end, but do all of that by the end of the 2030s, so quite a slow timeline, and we're looking specifically at current staging and how and when that might be best done. And this is really in addition to other things that we're looking at, other things that we're testing and other things that we're modelling, over-saving amongst low-income groups, providing flexibility in terms of short-term financial need. That could be through the effective, we're also looking at things like the effective use of opt-down, these sorts of other tweaks and calibration changes, and trying to ensure through modelling and assessment of evidence as to whether 8 to 12% that shift will be actually affordable for individuals and for employers, and how that can be made more affordable. I think also we need to think about who we're talking about and who I'm talking about. You know, I represent workplace pensions. I don't actually represent employers. And so much of what I'm looking at and why I'm speaking to all of you is because I'm looking at it from the scheme or the trust perspective. And that can be different. So we should acknowledge that that can be different than from the employer perspective on some of these elements. And so that does sort of, we should all be part of that debate really, because it's not a sort of sole individual lever that we're pulling. So finally, because we're talking about employers, and I promised I would get there, case studies. So these are just some examples, and really I'll just use these as a sort of way for me to stop waffling on. So the role of employers is crucial, alongside the role of schemes and alongside the role of individuals. So, you know, it's not one sort of party can't do the whole job. And I think what we've seen, at least during the pandemic particularly, is that the role of the employer can really be the first line of defence, and that's really significant in equipping employees with the right tools and the right guidance and the right support in the first instance. But we also know that I think Mercer, I think it was Mercer a couple of months ago, found that just over 60% of employers didn't know anything about their employees' financial wellbeing position. So again, there is a bit of a tension here between what is plausible as and possible and sort of positive as a first line of defence, and how much we know about what's actually happening there. So I just included some examples. These are examples from our pensions quality mark holders, so they're schemes and funds that hold the pensions quality mark. And they're doing some things like these. Again, we're going to be talking about these later. But I think, one of the things that I wanted to point out in this list is that it's not just support, information, guidance, higher contributions and that sort of thing, but it's also evaluation of success. I think one of the key things that employers can do alongside their scheme is that they can assess what has actually made a difference to outcomes. And I think that's really, really crucial and shouldn't be underestimated. I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'm going to talk even less about employers, actually. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk mostly about trade unions, unsurprisingly, because I think they're often a slightly kind of underappreciated actor when we're looking at occupational pensions. And I think they could certainly, they've got a lot of potential to be a force for good. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what we're aiming for in terms of contribution rates to occupational pensions. And there's been a lot of good work done on this, particularly from the PLSA and their work on retirement living standards. But there's some work being done at the moment by the Living Wage Foundation to try and turn those metrics and some other metrics into kind of something that looks more at inputs and looks at how much we've got to put in to get a decent outcome for people in retirement. And the work they're doing at the moment suggests that if you're looking at kind of the average employee, we need to be looking at about a 16% contribution rate, which will be a kind of a familiar figure to everybody. I think that's been long accepted as a rule of thumb, that if we want to get a decent pension out of a DC scheme, we need to put in about 15 or 16%. And that works out at about £3,000 a year for a low-paid worker. Looking at if they're just looking at younger workers and somebody who joins the pension scheme in their early 20s, they wouldn't need necessarily quite that high contribution level. It looks like you probably need about 12% to achieve a basic standard of living in retirement. So that's not a comfortable retirement. That is just the minimum, and that works out at about about £2,100 a year. Obviously, we are a very long way from that at the moment, and most people are certainly not on track for a comfortable retirement, and a lot are not on track to even meet that minimum requirement. Whenever we talk about raising that, I think at the moment, Alicia mentioned this, we run straight into you can't really talk about this during a cost of living crisis. So one of the first things the first slide I've got looks at what we think the real problem is. It's not really a short-term cost of living crisis, it's a long-term low pay crisis. And this chart shows pay from 2000 up to this year, January 2022. And it shows that basically we are in an unprecedented time. If we'd continued kind of going back and back, the line that keeps going up until about 2008 would be fairly steady over decades of kind of about 4% real increase a year. Sorry, about 4% nominal increase a year, about 2% real wage increase a year. We have done these charts where we kind of compare this to previous recessions, and we've got nothing over the last 200 years which looks like that. Always you've got kind of a dip and then we get back on track. So the fact that we are in now almost 15 years of pay stagnation is the real issue that we're facing at the moment, rather than necessarily kind of rising prices. But I think an important thing to note here is in the middle of this period we did introduce auto-enrolment, and we had extremely low opt-out. So I think that's a really encouraging sign. And again, it answers that question of now is not the right time. There's never a right time, and certainly on the employee side, we've seen that actually introducing auto-enrolment at a time where you've got a real squeeze on pay is not necessarily a reason for people to opt out. And that's quite encouraging. But it means that we need to focus both on raising pay and raising pension contributions, and we can't really afford to think of it as an either or. So how do we go about doing that? I think obviously we do have a preference, like other organisations, for increasing legal minimum contribution rates. We've got an ambitious 10% employer contribution target over the long term. I know that's a bit more of a stretch than a lot of organisations, but I think the key thing, again, pointing this chart, is that the majority, if not all, of any increased contributions have to come from the employer side. In terms of how we can go about encouraging employers without resorting to that kind of legislation, this is where unions come in. And I think the role of collective bargaining agreements is something which, again, is often overlooked in this country. If we look at where we kind of sit internationally, we are considerably below most of the European countries and a lot of OECD countries in the level of collective bargaining coverage in this country. If we were to look a little bit deeper than that and look at how many of these agreements actually cover pensions rather than just pay, it's difficult to get figures, but all the official sources say rates are very, very low. So we've got information on maybe about 100 employers where there is a collective agreement which allows unions to bargain for pensions as well as for pay. And if we look at what that looks like for those that are in DC schemes, what we can see is that minimum and maximum contribution rates on offer from the employer tend to be a lot higher. So if you look at the kind of this is not quite showing like for like on the chart. What we're comparing it on the left-hand side, we've got percentage of members in all schemes who are getting different contribution bands from their employers, defined contribution and group personal pension. And on the other side, we're looking at the percentage of schemes that are covered by collective agreements and what the contribution bands are there. And what leaps out is you've got these kind of almost half of people in a scheme which is covered by a collective agreement are getting minimum employer contributions in that 4 to 8 band, and about 40% are getting contributions above that as a minimum. And when we look at contribution structures, very often what you find is they will flip that auto-enrollment expectation. So you'll have people being auto-enrolled with kind of a very low employee contribution and a higher employer contribution. So maybe kind of a 2 and 6 or a 3 and 6 kind of contribution structure. And then they'll offer matching contributions to get people above and towards that kind of 15% that we're aiming for. So I think what I've looked at so far is mostly the kind of slightly negative aspect and how employers can be cajoled or forced into offering higher contribution rates. And also kind of the idea that defaults are really quite powerful. And I understand that from an employer perspective, that's probably not a very kind of good sell. That if you provide these things, it will be effective if either you're made to do it or if your employers don't really notice that you're doing it. So I think the last thing I'm just going to say is a little bit about the role that unions can play in kind of encouraging members to value their pensions. And I think we're probably not allowed to have a favourite union, but mine is probably CWU. Communication Workers Union, which I think people will probably be aware have had a kind of a long-running campaign programme to introduce a collective defined contribution scheme at the Royal Mail. And this was introduced, or this kicked off when Royal Mail decided to close their defined benefit scheme to existing members. Obviously, this went down badly. This was received pretty badly by the workers. There was quite a lot of confrontation at the time, and after a lot of discussion, they ended up with as long as you can design a new type of scheme that fits in with the contribution that we were happy to put into the DC scheme, and that our advisors say will work and it's fine, then yeah, we will go for this. So they came up with this collective DC scheme, which after many years and kind of after a big legislative push as well, is going to be launched later this year. And it's costing the Royal Mail as much as they're prepared to put into their DC scheme. But now, because of the work that CWU have done, their members absolutely love this pension. They have got kind of tens of thousands of champions for their collective DC pension. They've got, they've held ballots, they've got votes, they've got support for the scheme. And my cousin actually earlier this year started work as a postie, and within the first month he was told by his colleagues about this great pension scheme that they've got. And I think that's really quite unusual. So I think that's probably a good note to kind of leave it on, that that, yes, unions can probably drive a hard bargain and try and push people into doing more, but they can also really make sure that their members value what they get from their pension. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you both, and hello. I am going to talk about employers quite a lot, actually, because that's the research that we've been doing. So I'm really excited to share some early insights into some research we've been doing about employer pension contributions since last autumn. This is just the first findings. We'll be publishing the report later this year. Although contributions going in, as Alicia said, is one of the most important determinants of pension adequacy for employees, we've sort of lacked a clear view of what UK employers are doing in this space now that staging and phasing are complete and auto-enrolment is well established. So I'd like to really thank the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust for supporting this work to allow us to get a more comprehensive and also up-to-date understanding of the landscape, including sort of quite basically just how many employees are offered more than the minimum 3% employer contribution, and also how different employers structure their contributions, because there are lots of different models and ways of doing that. We also wanted to understand not just what is happening, but why things are the way they are. So how are contribution levels and structures decided? What sort of things are employers thinking about? What are their motivations if they do go beyond the minimum? And what are the barriers to them doing that if they don't? And finally, we wanted to also think about how things could be. What's the potential for evolution in this space? To what extent could employer contributions actually be a lever for change when we think about improving employee financial security? And are there different approaches that might work well or might work better when we think about both sides of that equation, employers and employees? Can we make more of the investment that employers are putting into employee pension contributions? What are the most promising opportunities for that? So we've been reviewing existing research and data. We've spoken to a lot of experts, some of whom are in this room and listening in on the live stream. And we've heard from over 500 employers in this research, as well as advisors and industry bodies. We conducted in-depth qualitative interviews. It actually takes quite a lot of time for some employers to describe what they've got in place. You know, some employers have 12 schemes or with different structures. And we also conducted a nationally representative employer survey, which was conducted by YouGov in March and April. The employer sample was broad, so whereas some studies focused just on larger or perhaps FTSE employers, here we included also those smaller employers who are often underrepresented when we look at this topic, although importantly they account for quite a lot of the employee experience. So nearly half of UK employees work for a small employer, that's one with less than 50 employees. This is quite a complex topic, and it involves looking at things like the percentage of employers doing different percentages of contributions, and also two really annoyingly similar words, employer and employee. So bear with me as I try and walk us through the insights as clearly and as simply as possible. It's really important to say that in conducting this research, we're not looking to prescribe or recommend any one approach, and we're certainly not looking to judge any employer. Employers, as Matthew said, have a really diverse range of contexts and circumstances, and our aim is just to reflect these as accurately as possible and to get the diversity within that so that we fully understand and appreciate the employer side of the question when we're thinking about the question of pensions adequacy. So before getting into the research learnings, it's worth remembering where we've come from. Before auto-enrolment, there were really big gaps in the employee experience depending on who they worked for. Some employees got something and some got nothing. And auto-enrolment has really broadened access to workplace pensions, particularly for those working for smaller employers. So we can see here, you know, the smaller employers, the line in terms of coverage going up dramatically at auto-enrolment. And now most employees are offered at least a minimum 3% employer contribution into a workplace pension scheme. As we've already observed, this was a huge undertaking for many employers and is a really great achievement and a really good equalisation story to get everybody to that minimum. When automatic enrolment was introduced, one question in the debate was whether those who were already doing more would level down. But the first thing that we can see in our research is that many employers are offering more than the minimum automatic enrolment contributions. So nearly 4 in 10 employers say that they offer more than 3% employer contribution to all of their employees, and a further 2 in 10 do that for some of their employees. And it's also worth remembering that many employers are boosting pension contributions in other ways. So around 4 in 10 say they calculate pension contributions on all earnings, not just the minimum required band of qualifying earnings. And half of employers offer matched contributions to some or all of their employees. That's where they put in more if their employee also puts more than the default level themselves. And 1/3 of employers offer that to all of their employees. And also, just over half of employers say that they offer a salary sacrifice arrangement to some or all of their employees, where the employee is likely to benefit from the additional national insurance saving adding to their contributions. However, there are variations under the surface when we look by employer size, and those working for larger employers are the most likely to get those boosts to their pension saving. So in these charts, the figures we've just seen for all employers are still shown with the pink bar, and the blue bars show this broken down by employer size, with the palest blue for small employers, those with less than 50 employees, the mid-blue for medium-sized employers with 50 to 250 employees, and the darkest blue for those with more than 250 employees. So looking at the dark blue, we can see that larger employers are more likely to offer more than the minimum 3% contribution to their employees. They're also more likely to make this contribution on all earnings rather than the minimum band of qualifying earnings. They are also more likely to offer a salary sacrifice arrangement and more likely to offer matched contributions. So those 4 factors combined act as a quadruple boost to employer pension contributions for many employees working for larger employers, which those working for smaller employers are much less likely to benefit from. And we also see that employees who are in manual roles, lower earning, and those with shorter tenure are less likely to receive more than the minimum employer contribution. So some sample sizes here are small, but looking at the chart on the right here, we can see that whereas 4 in 10 employers offer more than minimum contributions for all their employees, that drops to around 2 in 10 of those who say they have mostly manual employees and mostly low to moderate earning employees, and around 1 in 10 of those whose employees have mostly shorter tenure. And we see the same pattern on the left if we add in those who do more than the minimum for some but not all of their employees. And then looking at the ways in which employers differentiate between their employees and their pension contribution models, it's clear that current models are often directing any higher than minimum employer pension contributions to employees who are likely to be those who already have greater financial security and or they're more confident and active already. And that happens in a couple of ways. The first is matching. So we've seen just now that 1/3 of employers offer matched contributions to all their employees, with a further 17% offering matching to some of their employees. And this contribution model really rewards employees who are more financially confident and can afford to contribute more. The second way is that of those employers who offer higher than the minimum contributions for some, but not all of their employees, the most common reason for doing that was seniority, where a higher contribution is made by the employer for employees at certain levels or in certain roles. And 3 in 5 report seniority as the top factor behind contributing more than the minimum to some employees' pensions. So although the baseline has been raised, there are still some inequalities in the way that above minimum contributions are distributed. And so perhaps it's time for us to reflect on why things are the way they are and how they might evolve. So what are some of the drivers of the current employer pensions contribution landscape, and why do we see those levels and models that we've just seen? So as you perhaps would expect, affordability is an important factor for many employers. 1/3 of all employers say that minimising financial costs to the organisation was a factor they considered when setting the organisation's pension contribution levels. And looking at those who do the minimum 3% for all employees, half say the reason for this is that they can't afford to contribute more, and a quarter say it's because they're prioritising putting money into base salary. And we can probably expect that affordability is becoming more of a concern for many employers recently as they experience what some are calling a cost of doing business crisis alongside the cost of living challenges. But importantly, affordability is not the only factor driving employers to contribute at minimum levels. We also see that the minimum employer contribution levels set by the regulation act as strong defaults and are actually seen as recommended levels by some employers. So nearly 1/3 of employers doing the minimum contribution level say that this is because it's the amount recommended by government. I think we know that employees sometimes interpret the minimum contribution levels as a recommendation, but I'm not sure we've understood how powerful this interpretation is also amongst employers before. In addition, 1 in 5 of those doing the minimum were driven by the default setting in their payroll software or pension provider setup, and indeed 1 in 20 don't know that it is actually possible to contribute more than 3%. This perhaps suggests that there is some potential to disrupt these defaults where affordability is not a concern, for example, by building nudges to consider alternative approaches into the systems and platforms that employers are using to manage their pension contributions. Looking now at organisations who offer more than the minimum 3% for some or all of their employees, the reasons they give for that, the main reasons they give are retention, supporting employees to save for retirement, and recruitment. But I think it's useful to reflect, looking at these different reasons, that although just over half of employers say wanting to support their employees to save for retirement is a reason for contributing more than the minimum, and that's a common reason cited by both small and large employers, very few of those who do so have actually modelled retirement outcomes, so only 6% say they've done this. We know it can be difficult for employees to understand what their contributions today will mean for their retirement income, but perhaps more support would also be needed if their employers are to take this into account when making decisions about their contributions approaches. So lastly, let's take a look at the potential for evolution in pensions contributions and think about how feasible would any future change be. Well, the first thing to say is that organic opportunities to make changes to contribution models and levels are very limited. So nearly 2/3 of employers say their organisation is unlikely to implement a different approach to pensions contributions in the next 2 to 5 years, and that rises to 3/4 of smaller employers. The current challenging economic context, the inflexibility of legacy systems to the implementation of new approaches, and the complexity of some employers' pension provision all act as strong barriers to any change, even where there is an appetite for enhancing the existing model. And the couple of employer quotations here, I think, illustrate that. The first one talking about the cost of any payroll change being staggering, and the other one just talking about this is a really small part of my job, you know, we don't think about this very often. And that second quotation, we know that many individuals responsible for pensions decisions, particularly, but not only in smaller organisations, are not pensions experts. This is a small part of their job, and they lack the knowledge and confidence to consider doing anything other than default contributions. And we also heard, you know, some sort of fear repercussions from getting it wrong or feel like they're straying into giving advice. And sometimes, you know, reasonably frequently, it's just something that the accountant sorts out. And we had quite high levels of don't know answers to quite a lot of the questions in our survey. Additionally, financial security is seen by most employers to be mainly the employee's responsibility. So this sort of came out in some of the qualitative interviews, and we wanted to get a measure of this. So we asked survey respondents to rank who is most to least responsible for an employee's financial security and retirement out of those putting money into the pension pot, so out of the employee themselves, the employer, and the government. And we can see from this chart that responsibility is seen by employers to sit mostly with the employee. So 60% of employers say the employee is the most responsible, 20% say the government is most responsible, and only 13% say the employer is most responsible. And smaller employers are the least likely to see their role. So 63% of smaller employers think they are the least responsible out of those three, compared with only 28% of large employers thinking that. One reason for this is the employers we spoke to often said that they felt they could really only make a limited difference to one of their employees' outcomes in retirement, when employees may only be with them for a year or two and may have many other jobs in their working life. And I think it's really worth bearing these perceptions in mind, particularly when we think of proposals that ask for an equal split of contributions, for example, 6 employees, 6 employer, and with the bigger increase from today's levels coming from the employer, given how employers see the split of responsibility. However, having said all of that, there were quite high levels of interest in different contribution models despite those barriers to change. So we asked people about a number of different possible models for doing pension contributions, and each of these had an explanation in the survey. And salary sacrifice comes out top. It's considered appealing by more than 2/3 of employers. And that's perhaps not surprising, given it's a win-win for both employer and employee, boosting the money going into the pension without increasing the employer contributions bill. There were also quite high levels of interest in using defaults and nudges to support employees to save more, including auto-escalation approaches and higher defaults with the option for employees to opt down. And I think what we heard when we talked to employers is that those could either work in conjunction with higher employer contributions, or that alternatively, they could simply provide ways of employers doing something to support their employees to save more without increasing their own contribution bills. And in the current economic climate, perhaps these sorts of solutions present more pragmatic opportunities for some employers to support their employees' financial security in retirement than actually increasing contributions. But there can be challenges in implementation, particularly for smaller employers. So solutions that support more employers to consider and adopt approaches like these would be needed if these ideas that kind of are relatively well received are actually going to scale in practice. So I want to close by reflecting on two of the challenges at the heart of this topic that employers and others are often wrestling with. The first is that age-old tension between today and tomorrow's needs. Should employers who want to support their employees' financial well-being with limited resources focus their investment on today or tomorrow or both? Jack made quite a kind of strong argument for doing both, and I think you can see in the bottom employer quote here that they are literally splitting their budget in a rise between pay and pension. We heard in the top quote here, if we did have any money to spend, is that where we'd want to spend it, or would we be better to invest in other benefits? Kind of really wrestling with this, and particularly amongst employers who really want to support their employees with current cost of living challenges. And we know that employers are thinking about shorter-term focused benefits such as payroll-saving loans, shopping discounts and vouchers, and indeed some employers are making one-off lump sum cost of living payments to their employees. It's worth saying that employers are thinking partly about return on investment in terms of workforce response, and that sort of is likely to lead to a greater focus on shorter-term financial support and things that people are really kind of worrying about and caring about right now. But perhaps this is why there were also quite high levels of interest in hybrid solutions like sidecar saving, with 43% of employers saying that hybrid approaches combining pension saving and other forms of saving were appealing. And I think we've been looking at that from the point of view of sort of minimising the decision-making for employees, but perhaps there's something in that for employers too. If we can bring things together, it makes it easier to offer a holistic solution. The second challenge that I will close on is whether spend on pension contributions should be equally distributed or targeted at particular types of employee. And this was a really key difference in employers' thinking. Should we target our spend equally at those who need it most or at those who are most engaged? So around 1/3 of employers said equality would be a top priority if they were to implement a new pensions contribution approach. And I think the focus on equality in the kind of broader landscape is filtering through to how employers are thinking about how they structure their pension contribution models. But we also see that around 1 in 5 employers said that boosting retirement saving for those on the lowest incomes would be a top priority. And someone's saying here, if we could start again, I'd do something more generous on the first 20k and less generous after that. And we heard that a few times. And then we also see a similar proportion saying that contributing more for those who are most engaged with retirement saving would be a top priority, that kind of reward strategy of targeting the reward budget at the things that people care about and are kind of most motivated by. This feels like quite a fundamental philosophical divide underpinning some of the differences in approaches we see, and something I think we should think about exploring further going forward. So we look forward to sharing more detail in our upcoming report, but I hope that this has given an overview of some of the challenges and opportunities to lead into our discussion, and we would really welcome thoughts and responses from everyone in our audiences today, both in the room and on the live stream. Thank you.
Many thanks, Joe. Oh, yeah, certainly am now. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussion now, and I hope that all of that really fascinating thinking there has stimulated plenty of questions. In a moment, I'll be coming to the room in the usual way for a show of hands, and equally those of you who are joining us remotely can ask questions through the Slido platform. And actually, if you're in the room and you don't necessarily want to hear your voice booming out like mine from these speakers, you can also ask a Slido question. But before I do that, I just wanted to turn to Jack and Alicia particularly, because you've just been sitting watching Joe present as well, and just get a few reflections from you on the results we've just seen. And if it's all right, I might ask you just to focus on one particular theme which I saw coming out throughout those results, which is lots of positivity in there in terms of there's plenty of people who are getting an awful lot of support and more than the minimum from their employers, but a lot of differences, a lot of uneven distribution in terms of which size of employer you work for, whether you're a sort of higher earning salaried employee, whether you're more engaged and more active, and even schemes that are being offered universally, as Joe was pointing out, we see may only be the province of those who are able or willing to make an extra contribution to be able to get something for themselves. And so very often it's those who are least in need who are the ones who benefit from what the employer additionally has to offer. So we have this problem of distribution. We have a lot of winners and losers in this situation. Given the diversity of employers, given the diversity of different job types that we have out there, what from your position and your perspective would you say needs to be done to try to even out these outcomes for different types of workers at different types of organisations? Alicia, do you want to maybe go first?
I can try and go first, yeah. So I think it's a really big and important question. I think it's one that we have focused on quite a bit. I think there are a few things that Joe mentioned that really sort of stuck with me as she was talking. And I'll just pick a few examples because there were so many different things I could comment on. I think one of the things that is really very interesting to me in the finding is that some employers are considering the minimum as the recommended level. And we know that is the case for employees, but that employers think that too is really fascinating, because you might hope and expect that employers had understood that there was quite a sort of baked-in understanding that voluntary contribution, that in the way that AE was designed, that voluntary contributions would be a big sort of component of getting some of their workforce at least to a more adequate saving rate. So I think that's really interesting and could have quite contra or counter sort of effects when we're talking about things like auto-escalation, lower earners, and sort of distributing higher pension benefits to those that do or don't value them more or less. You know, it's really interesting sort of impact there if we're thinking about, well, the recommended level is the minimum or isn't it the minimum, and who we're trying to address the issues for, those that value it, those that don't even know that it exists. It's a very interesting sort of problem. So from a sort of theoretical level, I find that fascinating. And I think the other thing that I would just comment on is on that sort of distributional effect, something that Joe mentioned as well was trying to sort of, for those that have either short tenure or multiple jobs, maybe at once, that's about 4% of the population, I think, don't quote me on that, or have had sort of times out of work. People often refer to women here. We all know that the proportion of women in work has increased quite significantly over time, but the proportion of, there are actually more women in the country than there are men. So, you know, there are lots of women out of work also at any given time. And some of the things that we've thought about are sort of targeted, specific tweaks to automatic enrolment to try and quote-unquote correct for those times out of work. And I think, again, that links back to this idea that there could be sort of quite interesting distributional or redistributional efforts and attempts that are quite specifically targeted, but that may or may not work for certain elements of the population at certain times. And again, that's quite a difficult problem to address when everyone's an individual and their pathway through life is different. So I think, yeah, there were a couple of things that struck me about opportunities for change and sort of that positivity that you described. You know, there is a lot of interest, I think, out there for change, but also some of the really knotty issues that would need to be thought through as to how that how that change could be affected most effectively across the piece and for specific targeted audiences.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I think I would agree that you probably haven't thought enough about how employers think about the minimum contribution rates. And when you do think about it, it makes sense. I think if you're a small employer and the government is making you offer your employees a pension scheme, you would assume that it would be a sufficient one. So that did actually make a lot of sense to me. And I think also it's interesting kind of looking at the numbers of people who are offering higher than that minimum level because it was expected in their sector. And that's kind of quite interesting looking at the importance of kind of trying to establish some kind of norms that are maybe slightly better than the minimum. I found the really high number of people that were offering higher contributions to more senior people quite depressing, given the kind of the relative needs there. And I thought that possibly a thing that made me think of, and that I think would be interesting to get more thoughts on from employers, was this idea that is being pursued by Living Wage Foundation about possibly having kind of a cash underpin to make sure everyone was getting a sufficient amount, rather than just relying on offering the recommended percentage. And I suspect, not knowing a lot about how payroll works, that might be quite complicated. But on a kind of theoretical level, that seems like a really good idea for if you say, look, we just can't afford to offer our whole staff 16% or whatever it is, but we do want to make sure that everyone is getting, a living pension. I think so. I'm interested to know whether there are A, that sounds appealing to employers, and B, if there are lots of practical barriers around doing that. I think that was it for my notes. Oh, and also I think it does maybe show that it's probably quite important to increase the minimum contribution rates. That was one of my takeaways as well.
It's very telling, isn't it, that we always think about behavioural biases as being things that people experience, but employers are people too, and people making decisions at employers are people too. And so the power of these effects, like defaults, when you're given a level to start at, you stick at it. Social norming, because everyone else is doing this, I'm going to do this too. They're really powerful too. But as I think you were both alluding to, in the end, what's mandatory is the thing that will really drive sort of equality across the piece. Fascinating stuff. Are there any questions now from the floor here? And we've got some remotely already, but I'm going to start on the floor. One at the table over there, if we can get a mic over there, and if you wouldn't mind saying who you are and where you come from before you ask your question.
Hello. Hello. Oh, can you hear me? Hello. Hello. I'm Maggie. I'm here on behalf of REBA this morning. I thought one of the things I found quite interesting on one of Joe's slides was the 34% who were offering more than the minimum contributions because a senior member of their organisation had recommended it. And without wishing to bring our friends down the river into this, look, culture starts at the top and change starts at the top. Do you think one of the things we need to do is actually just get more buy-in from very senior leadership to increase pensions? What difference do you think that would make?
Joe, during the study, we talked to a lot of people sort of in the employer space and those who work with them. What were you finding about the role of those senior voices?
So, am I on? I found that interesting too, and I think there is a sort of broader cultural shift that I think is impacting how some employers are starting to think about pensions contributions. We had one example of a very large UK employer, and when I interviewed them about how they had decided to set their pensions contributions levels at the level they set them at, expecting an answer that would involve kind of benchmarking and benefits consultants, the answer was, our chief executive said this is what the level should be. And I think some of that is being driven by actions like, the Investors Association saying that they will kind of put a warning flag on any organisation that hasn't kind of got an equalisation strategy. So I do think sort of some of those external factors and considerations are starting to influence this, and that can be quite powerful, because in that example, over 30,000 employees got a pensions contribution raise as a result of that happening. So yeah, I agree. I think that is a really, potentially hopeful sign. And I think we did hear more generally in the interviews about equality and people starting to question really established ways of thinking about pensions contributions, like matching, which is a really dominant model that is often recommended as a way of boosting engagement. People really saying, actually, now I think about it, I'm not sure that that is what we want to have in an organisation where we are trying to treat people equally.
And I mean, Jack, presumably this is as true in collective bargaining situations, that the sort of the individual voices and the individual attitudes of people in the room are sort of as important as the big policies and the legal framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And it's interesting, we often only kind of think about the attitudes of executives to pensions when it relates to annual lifetime allowance, and we assume people will lose interest in pensions when they can no longer necessarily benefit from them quite so much, which I think probably does most people a bit of a disservice. But yeah, absolutely. I think kind of having key people recognising it's important, and also kind of other stakeholders. I guess kind of the role of asset owners as well. I think it's something that I think pressure can be brought, certainly.
And Alicia, I mean, that was something I was thinking, having come from a consultancy background myself. Very often the people who are making the decisions are in some completely off-book, unregistered thing anyway, and very often don't have the lived experience of what it's like, let alone the lived experience of being on a lower income. So how do you affect the mindset of people who are making those decisions?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea. I think we have in the pensions industry quite a good pedigree, actually, of sort of championing examples of good success and that sort of thing, championing good schemes, championing good solutions, championing good things. I think one of the things because I'm sort of vehemently agreeing, I was trying to think of something different to say. So one of the things that I wonder is the effect of dashboards. So maybe everyone in the future becomes more engaged with their pension, in theory. And so maybe everyone sort of becomes a bit more of a mini pensions champion. And so in a sense, we've seen some of that effect with things like ESG interest in certain pockets of the industry and these sorts of things. So maybe the sort of democratization of pensions as a good thing might help to influence either the decision makers or just sort of more generally in society, we might become more pensions focused. So I'm not disagreeing with anything that anyone said. I'm just trying to add something additional that, I think maybe all of us in a sense could become the sort of champions for good pensions in the future.
We've got some terrific questions coming in from outside, and I'm going to throw a couple of them at, and any of you who want to respond, please do. I was going to pick out Russell's first question there. Russell's been busy. Russell Wright. I think it's a really interesting one. There's another sort of behavioural nudge here, which is social proofing. What impact do you think requiring pension contribution levels to be disclosed publicly by employers would have on contribution levels? Now, I mean, obviously they often are disclosed, but it's not something that's sort of necessarily put front and centre in the employer offer. You look on employer websites in the recruitment sections, very often it's just not even mentioned. So would that help? Would having to be more public increase that sort of social proofing mechanism?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly when it comes to things like job adverts, I think that's we've seen that with pay. Transparency is great, and it does really drive behaviour. So, and I think you would then hope that it would register more with people when they were looking for jobs. I think it's interesting there was a slight difference between kind of employers that were saying they think this is a good tool for recruitment, and those that were saying paying high contributions was a good tool for retaining staff. I'm not surprised that it is something which employers thought was more useful for retaining than recruiting, because I think it is something that people will tend to appreciate the longer they stay at a company, rather than necessarily kind of looking for that when they are starting out. So yeah, I think anything that raises the profile at that stage would be certainly helpful.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought, and I can see there's a specific PLSA question here as well, so I'm going to throw that at you, Alicia. Would you support would the organisation support some of the additional percentage that you're advocating being accessible as emergency savings? And there's obviously a broader question there about how much should anything you're doing for pensions potentially bleed into other areas of financial support.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's something that we've looked at for sure. Emergency savings, payroll savings, sidecar savings, all of these sort of other alongside savings vehicles or alongside pension savings vehicles and sort of non-traditional pension savings vehicles. I think one of the things that we have looked at also just on that sort of wider financial well-being or wealth front is what it used to be called. It used to be called wealth. We don't tend to refer to it as that anymore. Includes like things like property wealth, other sources of assets, inheritance. Sadly, one of the things that we found with those sort of other potential sources of retirement income, so just talking about these two things separately for a second. So there's the wealth aspect, which is often cited as potentially very beneficial for what we would consider to be wealthy people. So if you have a large pension, you may well have a large house, crudely. And so that's a potential source of income for some, but it's likely to be for the very wealthy. So there is likely to be a sort of access point and innovation point around access to illiquid savings that would be beneficial at that end of the spectrum. Putting that aside, then there's also the sort of the lower income and or less financially stable cohort, and for that cohort, that's where sidecar, emergency, all of those other sort of sources of potential savings, but that's much more focused not on retirement income but on immediate needs, is also a component that we've looked at. So we're looking at everything. We're not being exclusive about what we think that, you know, the sort of pension solutions of the future should look like. It's likely just that those things will be beneficial, as Nest Insight has found, very beneficial for very different people and used in very different ways. And so I think one of the other things I was just going to mention that I didn't mention about Joe's presentation earlier was the sort of the concept, and I mentioned it too, the concept of the average pensioner or the average saver, and that's really difficult to define. And, you know, we should be really mindful of that when we're looking at framework changes, because sidecar and emergency savings will be fantastically helpful for some people and complete irrelevance for others. And so we must be mindful of that. We're trying to think much more holistically than that.
That's really fascinating. That point about personalisation is one we could probably spend a whole panel talking about. I was going to say when I asked that question that the Pensions Minister had advocated for 1% of earnings to go into emergency savings, but as of 8 o'clock this morning, of course, not something I can necessarily say. I'll take another question from the floor, just over here.
Hi, I'm John Parker from Reddington. Thanks very much for a really interesting set of presentations. I mean, any discussions around increasing minimum levels of auto-enrolment contributions will at some point need to touch on the subject of pensions tax relief. Now, I'm sure there may not be a desire to get sucked down that particular rabbit hole, but I'd be interested in sort of general views on the extent to which considerations around tax relief structure needs to be changed.
Does anyone want to pick up tax relief? I'm looking at you.
Shall I give, so that we don't get dragged down the rabbit hole? Last year, we did a massive piece of work on pensions tax relief, which you're probably very familiar with. We see the findings of that. Broadly speaking, it was, we've looked at everything and it's probably as good as it's going to get, which was a sort of interesting, not our expected finding. We genuinely went in with an open mind. We are mindful of that position in light of what we're looking at now, sort of more generally on adequacy, and we have had some very early conversations about the connections between, or if there is a need for changes. Just a sort of side note, but I feel like it's relevant when we're talking about money in. The other big component that we've thought about much more keenly this time around is actually in retirement state benefits and support. I raise it in the context of tax relief because it's another thing that can have a sort of slightly unusual effect at certain income sort of brackets and categories. And I suspect, don't know, prejudging, but I suspect that we might say more about that this time around and this year and talk about that and sort of connecting tax relief as part of the whole package, because that was a component that has become very immediately apparent from some of the research and the modelling that we've done. So I've sort of dodged the question by not answering at all about tax relief. But we did a lot of work on tax relief. That all still stands in effect. But who knows? You know, there may be ill effects or unusual effects at certain income brackets.
Thank you.
All sorts. Yes, all sorts. I'm so tempted to get into a huddle.
I'm going to suggest you go into a huddle afterwards. just to give us time for at least a couple more questions. Next one was just over here. If we could get a mic over there. Thank you.
Hi, Mick Mackett here from the Financial Inclusion Centre. My question is really about financial resilience and workplace savings, not automatic enrolment. But by the way, I do think that automatic enrolment has been one of the biggest public policy successes in my lifetime as a campaigner, and I think Nest is one of the best institutional innovations I've seen as well. So I think public policy reform can work if there is momentum behind it. But as I said, my question is really about financial resilience, not just sort of pension planning. And since 2008, we have made no progress in this country in building financial resilience amongst low to medium income households. I mean, seriously, it's been incredibly disappointing. Now, employers can play a big role in helping people build financial resilience through workplace savings. And we've been working in Scotland with 2 major credit unions. And so far, we've persuaded 13 of the biggest employers in Scotland to offer workplace savings to their employees. And that is now covering 100,000 employees. So it can be done. And I know people are thinking about experimenting with sidecar savings. There's going to be pilot studies set up, and the Pensions Minister, as was, recommended 1% going into that. But all that stuff takes time. But in the meantime, can we not do more to persuade the biggest employers to at least provide access to workplace savings? Because the research we did, supported by the Money and Pensions Service, I think it's one of the most compelling pieces of work we've ever done. It showed that workplace savings makes a significant difference to the financial resilience, particularly of low to medium income workers. So what can we do, guys, to actually get workplace savings at least made accessible to people who really need it? Yeah.
Joe, do you want to pick up on what we're seeing? I mean, in terms of how employers are responding.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. So I think, we absolutely think that coverage is part of that question. So employees having access to workplace savings gets us part of the way there, but we think that's only part of the way there. So, in trials that you've conducted, in trials that we're currently conducting, we can see that employees want to save, they like the idea of payroll saving, but most of them don't get around to signing up to save. Many of you will be aware that we're currently conducting a trial of an opt-out or auto-save approach to payroll saving with Suez Waste and Recycling and with their credit union Transave UK. And although it's early days, we're seeing really quite meaningful differences in participation in that payroll saving amongst their employees. With really quite sort of impactful outcomes even in the early days for them. So people who have never been savers before becoming savers, people who thought that they couldn't afford to save, saving at least £40 a month. So I think, coverage is part of that, but we have to think about how do we support employees to actually use that tool and benefit from it. And then I think the other kind of consideration that is highlighted through the research on pensions contributions, but is the same when we think about shorter term saving, is around how do we support employers to implement those solutions, particularly those who don't have someone whose job title is financial wellbeing or reward or even HR, but maybe just have an ops person, a managing director, someone who, perhaps isn't that financially secure themselves. How do you scale this? And that's where I think we have to think about the platforms and the services that employers are already using, the systems they put in place for automatic enrolment, the payroll solutions, the kind of interfaces, the relationships they have there. Because otherwise I think, maybe larger employers will roll this out, but we're not reaching the nearly half of UK employees who work for smaller employers.
Thank you for that, Joe, because that's a fantastic segue. I was just going to ask one more of our Slido questions, which exactly speaks to that, and I'll throw that at Jack and Alicia if you want to pick it up, which is, obviously a lot of great stuff being done by large employers, but have we seen any examples of innovations or approaches that can get small employers in a position where, as Joe says, they can overcome these barriers and the lack of specialism and the lack of support to be doing more in the way of these sorts of programs? Or not?
So I guess so I gave some examples from our pensions quality mark. They're not exclusively ginormous employers, and some of the things that we see are really quite sort of innovative and sophisticated and targeted and or really personal. I think that's one of the things that I would say about smaller employers. They do have an advantage in a sense in that they can have real actual conversations with real actual humans, as I described to you all as well. So there is a sort of more human element that's a potential for smaller employers, I think, and we do see things, briefings, teach-ins, lunch and learns, all of those sorts of things that we know about at big employers, but being done on a sort of very personalised, ongoing, almost sort of semi-informal basis that might be a sort of potential avenue for smaller employers. But I'll have to think if there's anything particularly sort of cool that I can think of. I'll have to think if there's really some specific cool stuff that I've seen for small employers.
Well, Judge, do you want to add something?
We're also struggling for specific examples, but I think the potential for kind of sector-wide schemes is probably something which we need to really, really work on.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. Thank you. We had one more question here from the floor, if we could get a mic over here, and I think this is going to be our last question, I'm afraid, because we're coming up to the end of the panel. Thanks, David.
Hi, Brendan Shanks from Husky. When we were kind of researching and developing our software to assist SMEs with implementing salary exchange, what kind of shocked us was we found that payroll systems in almost all cases, and some where they couldn't implement this, or the software doesn't allow, or is extremely difficult for the operative to allow the national insurance saving from the employer be directed to the individual's pension pot. And I was wondering, because it's so obviously Joe's slides, 55% of employers offer a salary exchange arrangement. Do they actually channel their savings to, or is there any data or understanding of those savings going to the employee? And likewise to Joe, in a collective bargaining arrangement, does that come into that at all?
Thanks, Brendan. I thought you might pick up on that data point. I think we heard a mixture from employers in terms of, first of all, not all employers were aware of salary sacrifice as an option before we talked to them about it, including in the survey. And I think there are then some decisions, right, about what happens to that national insurance saving. Employers looking at everything from putting all of it into the employee's pension to them keeping their bit and the employee getting their bit, to should we divert some of that saving into a shorter term savings vehicle so that we are, providing an emergency savings pot alongside pension saving. And I think, the systems point is really important there, because employers can only think about those things and make those decisions if first of all they know about them and they're suggested to them, and secondly if they can implement them without, as one employer said, it's $500,000 every time we lift the bonnet on our payroll system. So it feels to me that there is huge potential there, but we need to think really carefully about how do you support that and how do you scale that.
And Jack?
And the answer is, I'm afraid I don't know. But I would hope so in those few arrangements where you've got an agreement that covers both pay and pensions, but I'm not sure.
And I'm not sure seems like a great note to end on. We're actually going to end by asking you all a question which is going to come through Slido, and I'm hoping this is going to come up on screen because I managed to delete it from my iPad. So here we are. That's good news. So this is both for people in the room and out of the room, and you can have a bit of a think about this while you're in the break that I'm about to send you all off on, which is in the context of the current cost of living challenges. Would you rather see employers focusing any additional financial wellbeing budget on supporting long-term financial security, immediate or short-term financial issues, or a combination of the two? So this is basically the question that we asked employers in the survey, how to do that balance given the situation we're in at the moment. So leaving that question with you, I'd just like you to thank, in the usual way, our fantastic panel.
Okay, well, welcome back everybody who's in the room from lunch or who's joining us online if you were with us this morning, or welcome for the first time those who are joining for the first time this afternoon. We're now going to head into our second panel. Just a reminder for everybody about our desire to keep this event as interactive as possible. So if you're joining from home for the first time, or if you've just joined in person in the lunch break, you can put your questions to the panel using slido.com and the hashtag NestInsight2022. We'd also love you to join in on social media with the same hashtag, and of course there will also be a roaming mic or roaming mics in the room for those who want to ask questions via that mechanism. Okay, I'm going to move on then to introduce our second panel. So I think Alicia said this morning we don't talk about wealth anymore, we don't use the language of wealth anymore, but this panel is very much about wealth. As I said earlier in my intro, with Nest Insight, we've tried as much as possible to take a broad view of people's financial lives and the challenges that they face, and to see the goal of building financial security in retirement within that broader view. And to date, a lot of our work has therefore been focused either directly on retirement saving issues or increasingly on emergency saving and short-term financial resilience and the link that has to retirement well-being. But to some extent, those can just be seen as kind of bookends in a broader overall picture of financial well-being and of people's capacity to build and maintain wealth, both for specific goals and for the more general benefits that wealth can bring. So we're really excited this year to be doing a piece of horizon scanning work looking at the whole topic of wealth building and financial well-being, and starting to think about the next set of research and innovation challenges in that space that can support broader and expanded access to wealth, supported by our partners BlackRock, to whom we're hugely grateful for their support in that work. We're very much at the start of our thinking on this topic. Indeed, just in the run-up to today, we've been talking a lot about the language, wealth building. What do we mean by wealth? Is wealth the right terminology? What forms of wealth do we think about within that goal of wealth building, and forms of wealth that might be more or less relevant to the low and moderate income target market on whom we're primarily focused? We know from our research elsewhere, for example, our language research in the pension space with Invesco, how important the language of these topics is, and how small changes in language and framing can make a huge difference to how people think about financial topics. So we really don't claim to have got very far on this topic yet. We're still thinking about how we talk about it. I'm sure that how we talk about it will evolve in the months to come from how we talk about it today. We're also conscious that this is somewhat new territory for us, but it's an area that in its different guises is populated by a lot of excellent individuals and organisations already. We're really looking forward to speaking to more and more of those people over time and learning their views on this topic that will help to shape our own views and to understand their perspectives to kind of form how we think about this work. Thankfully, across this huge and complex topic, we are joined today by three such experts who I will now introduce. So Joanna Smith-Romani is the Managing Director at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Programme, who many of you will know are a long-standing research partner and collaborator with Nest Insight. I've got Joe Richardson, who is Research Manager at Living Wage Foundation, and Lindsay Judge, who is Research Director at the Resolution Foundation. And between us, we're going to cover a very broad range of topics related to wealth. But before we do, there may or may not be a Slido question coming. Is there a Slido question coming? Okay, excellent. So here's the question. No, that's the last question. So we'll move on to the next question, which should be, which inequalities or solutions around supporting wealth building for low and moderate income groups do you think require the most research and innovation? Financial resilience and emergency saving, housing wealth, security of work, access to investments and capital markets, retirement wealth, or something else? This is genuine fact-finding for us. We're really interested to hear what you think is important in this space as we start to embark on this work. So try and get your answers in. We'll keep that open in the background. And while you're thinking about that, and in the meantime, I will hand over to Joanna to kick us off.
Super. Good afternoon, everyone. As Will said, I'm Joanna Smith-Romani with the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. We're based in Washington, D.C. I am so excited to be traveling internationally for work, and I haven't really been in a room with this many people in a long time, so this is a thrill in so many ways. But for those of you who don't know Aspen, really quickly, we are a national nonprofit think tank that focuses on how do you equip leaders with the kinds of ideas and networks they need to take action. So a little different from normal think tanks, we're not just about what are the right solutions, what's the right perspective, what should you do, but really around how do you convene the set of stakeholders that can do something big about it, and how do we get everyone excited to do that big thing, and willing to put themselves out there to make that happen. So our current area of work, which makes sense for the financial security program, is a new portfolio on the future of wealth. It's so interesting that the term wealth, we've talked a lot about that in the US too. Does it actually have any meaning for low to moderate income households? I'm not really sure, but just so you guys know, when I mean wealth, I mean actual like financial money, the money they need to manage their life, to manage the risk into their life, and to manage the opportunities in their life. So there's all other kinds of ways to measure wealth, but that's really what we're looking at. People need money and wealth to survive and thrive in their lives. When we started this portfolio of work, we do quite a bit of consumer insights work, so working directly with impacted families, low wealth families in the US, to understand what does wealth mean to them, and really wanting to start from the place of what is the real lived experiences of households in the US. In preparing for this with Will and Michelle, I was like, I don't know how much of this is a specific, so specific to the US or feels like it's relevant to you guys, so take it with a grain of salt. My sense from talking to them and talking to my colleagues on this panel and some of the meetings I've had this week is that it's becoming more and more relevant here in ways that maybe aren't great for the UK. I don't think anyone really wants to be like the US in our financial security problems. So maybe this is a forecasting experiment, a bit of a futurist experiment of where you might get to, and please don't get there. But wealth has these 5 really important functions in people's lives. Resilience, we talked about that a little bit earlier today. Investment for mobility, how do you pay for college? How do you take risks for new job opportunities? Intergenerational support, that's a ton of it. I want my kids to have things for their kids to have things for their kids to have things. Mental and physical well-being and quality of life, we actually touched on this in the last session in really important ways. The one thing I'll just quickly say, especially as I've arrived in a country facing a real political and government challenge at the moment, is ownership, voice, and control. Having wealth actually allows you to participate more fully in democracy. And where we are seeing democracy struggle in the US, a lot of it is along the lines around inequality, honestly. In the US, again, very US context specific, I hope you're not here yet, don't let yourself get here yet, but we're on the wrong trajectory, frankly. We haven't seen this much wealth inequality since the 1920s. And as net worth has stagnated for most households in the US, obviously debt has climbed. And I know that's a story here in the UK too, with increasing kinds of debt and different kinds of debt than families have experienced before. There are super major wealth gaps that can't be ignored in the US anyways, around racial and ethnicity wealth gaps, gender wealth gaps, geographical wealth gaps, where you live in the country matters a lot. And importantly, generational wealth gaps. So our youngest Americans are not set to do as well as their parents and grandparents, and that's really tragic and shameful. The last thing I'll say about this is that in the US anyways, it's a majority problem. This isn't a boutique problem, this isn't a poor person problem. This is like most of the country is facing this wealth inequality issue. So we broke down wealth holdings across the different deciles in the country to really show this. So it's really important to note that more than half of US households don't have much wealth, right? We're on like the left side of this grid. The second decile, for those of you who can't see in the back, I couldn't when I was sitting back there earlier, is around a median of $1,600 in wealth. In the US, that's like not even an emergency, right? That barely gets you through one financial emergency. And importantly, this first decile, like 10 to 13% of the US right now, is sitting in negative net worth of around $18,000. So we are not even starting from like, oh, they just don't have wealth, let's build it. We are like way back in the $20,000 of debt that we have to start from to get these families any kind of wealth. Half of those households are 35 and above. This isn't just a young person's problem where you think when you're young, you start with some debt, but then, the financial life cycle brings you out of it. That is actually not the case. It's for younger folks driven by student loan debt, which I know is an emerging problem in the UK, if not already a problem. And it's disproportionately Black households. So there's a huge racial element to who's experiencing negative net worth. This is kind of a fun slide because it just sort of shows what's in everyone's bucket, if you remember the slide before. The quick things I'll say is that the typical household only has 3 kinds of assets: transaction accounts, vehicles, and homes. 2 of those things require debt to get, right? You borrow for a car, you borrow for a home. One of those things is depreciating the car. So these aren't really the most valuable assets from the get-go, right? They require a lot of time and investment to mean anything. And where you really only see meaningful wealth appear in the US is around the 6th, 7th, and 8th, where retirement sits. So I'm sure our Nest friends will find that very good to know, but we're not seeing real wealth unless you also layer in retirement accounts. And of course, we don't have as robust a kind of inclusive system as you guys have in the UK, even with all the problems we've been talking about today. So it's really necessary, at least in the US context, to acknowledge that this inequality, these disparities, don't come from personal failures. This isn't because Black people or Black women or people that live in the South have done something wrong. We in the US have created, and I don't think this is really different around the world, we decided to prioritize wealth for certain people while stripping it away for other people. So we exist in a country that has a legacy of slavery and genocide. There's huge macroeconomic trends that are making this harder. We spoke about those a little bit during the Chatham House rules. And there's a whole interaction of various systems that are designed to not be inclusive, that are purposefully designed there to harm certain people and benefit others, like our labor markets, our education markets, the way we do healthcare, our capital markets, our housing markets. It's just let me go on and on and on about the set of interacting systems that make it hard to build wealth. And then there's specific barriers that we have to confront and solve for. And the way I bucket these are access to public and private benefits, both of those, how they interact with each other, how they either catapult you forward or in the absence of them. And we have a lot of occupational segregation. It sounds like that's not totally different here in terms of who has access to retirement schemes, how those schemes are helping people, who do they help the most. That really impacts wealth. There's also increased costs of housing, healthcare, dependent care, education. I've heard about a lot of the cost of living work happening here, so you guys are deeply knowledgeable and aware of that. And then there's just a whole product side. There are kind of bad lending products. We don't have particularly good regulatory supervision of our lending world, and that is deeply harming people. So given that really terrible story I just told you guys, we still are bullish that we can do something about this for the US. And in part, we built this wealth building model to kind of get us there. How do we get a real inclusive wealth building pathways for families? So it starts on the left side, and I really do think this is not US based, right? This is kind of how it works for people where wealth is up to the individual to raise for themselves. So the first precondition is financial stability. It means positive cash flow, right? You every month have more income than you spend. You have to start there, and you don't have debt that's harmful to you. So you have little or no debt, and the debt you have is maybe, you're usually not an asset-producing debt till you get here, but at least it's not harming you. The terms and conditions are good, and you can manage the debt payments. Then you actually have to amass some amount of savings, right? You need to have enough more money every month than you spend that you can actually start squirreling it away. You need an investable sum of money. Then you purchase or make your asset. Sometimes you can purchase it, sort of purchase retirement, right? You invest in the market, you invest in a retirement plan. Sometimes you have to leverage, so you need credit to be able to do that. And we talked a little bit, there was a tension about this in the last panel, but people do actually also need the information and confidence to make these huge financial decisions. It's not the most important thing, but it is not a thing. It's actually essential. And then finally, and where at least in the US we have not spent sufficient time on, we actually have to spend time around wealth protection. How do we make sure retirement accounts don't get drained? How do people's homes, especially in Black neighborhoods and brown neighborhoods, get assessed at the right value so they are actually growing in value over time? You know, how are we not pulling from these things every time there's an emergency? And then the last thing I'll mention is we actually just released, and you can find this on futureofwealth.org, 101 solutions for inclusive wealth building, and we bucketed them by what I just said, right? So unsurprisingly, because of the problems we see in the US, we need a ton of solutions in that first financial stability category about how do we boost cash flows? How do we just make sure people get by and don't get by on debt and credit, which is what we see too much of? Then how do people have affordable assets to purchase? How do we democratize access to the capital markets? Where can people go for kind of micro investing in different kinds of property investments? Then of course, consumer-friendly financing options. I talked about how terribly we do that in the US. How can people get the right kind of confidence, learning, knowledge at the right moments to make wealth building decisions that are big and huge? And then wealth protection, as I mentioned. And finally, and importantly, if you want to do anything that's racially reparative, that actually takes into account, you know, the original forms of slavery and genocide and what we've done in our country over hundreds of years, you actually have to actively do that in policy and in product decision making. So we have a set that very specifically call out how do you do that and make that difference. This is just me promoting the rest of our research. So I will turn it over to other Joe, people call me Joe too, but just to say we have a portfolio of research on this, the original foundations of a new wealth agenda, which has the insights work that I told you about, that is our foundation, disparities in debt, debt being a big racial driver of the racial wealth gap in the US, and I suspect other places, and then of course the 101 solutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonah. What a great way to start the panel. So yeah, as it says up there, my name is Joe. I'm the research manager at the Living Wage Foundation. So I want to build on Joanna's presentation by looking at kind of the wealth model that she outlined and by explaining how the particular kind of group of workers that we tend to work with at the Living Wage Foundation fall into that precondition area and are often restricted as a result of the way that they are paid and the way their hours are organized from actually getting to any level of wealth building. So before I go into any level of thematic discussion, I just want to clarify what the living wage actually is. So the living wage is, as you can see from my wonderful infographic, it's £9.90 in the UK, that's outside London, and £11.05p in London to reflect the higher living costs in the capital. Now, this is just a little bit of an explainer on how our rate differs from the national living wage, which is effectively a government's rebranded minimum wage. So our rate is independently calculated by the Resolution Foundation and a group of economists, and it's actually rooted in living costs, i.e. if you earn this rate and you work full-time, you'll be able to have enough money to live. And that includes things like housing costs, things like travel costs, things like having a savings buffer, all of those things. Obviously, there's a regional variance in that because there's so much higher living costs in the capital, which means that you obviously need the higher rate. Now, the actual government national living wage is anything to do with living costs, really. It's more of a rebranded wage floor. And as I say, yeah, it's not due to keep up with living costs, more about median earnings. So yeah, just a point of clarification there. And when I talk about people that are paid less than the real living wage, I am talking about the £9.90 across the UK and £11.05p in London. So, onto the scale of low pay as defined by being paid less than the real living wage. So as you can see from the slides, there's currently about 1.6 of all jobs in the UK that are paid less than the living wage, and that's around 17.1% as a proportion. That's 4.8 million in total. Now I just want you to focus a little bit for the moment on the kind of the right end of the graph. So as you can see, there's been quite a significant dip in the amount of low paid jobs. So there was 5.4 in April 2020, and there's now 4.8 in April 2021. So there are three key drivers of this, two of which are positive, one of which is not so much. So the first one is the increased unemployment among low-paid workers as a result of the pandemic. So for example, I know that unemployment has largely remained stagnant, and people think it's the dog that hasn't barked so far through the pandemic, but nevertheless, there was early evidence that at least in the offset of the pandemic, that low-paid workers are more likely to fall out of work altogether. And as a result, they were no longer in the labour market data, and therefore the amount of low-paid jobs went down. Secondly, and more positively, we've also seen quite significant increases to the national living wage, the wage floor. So it went up from £8.72 to £8.91, and then again to £9.50. And while that rate is going consistently below the real living wage, it does tend to have ripple effects across the income distribution as employers try to maintain things like wage floors. And finally, there's the growth of the living wage movement itself. So we've seen record accreditations since the pandemic, and we've also seen record level of uplifts, and that started to resemble out in the data, which is really positive. However, so there is sort of two sides to this coin. So while the scale of low pay is going down, the data does suggest that the actual impact and the bite of low pay is actually getting worse. So again, looking at the graph on this particular slide, what you can see is that among low-paid workers, across every single financial well-being measure, things are getting worse. So they're more likely to fall behind with household bills, more likely to skip meals, more likely to be unable to heat their homes, fall behind on rent, and get a payday loan to cover the mortgage, to cover essentials rather. So yeah, I mean, as you can see, it is the cost of living crisis, which is really severely impacting these low-paid workers. And if you look at the different time frames, so December 2020 was where the blue bars were taking place. That was kind of during the pandemic, and the cost of living crisis is making things significantly worse even than during COVID. And it probably is important to stress that January 2020 was when the orange bars, that's the details were on the orange bars, and CPI inflation was around 5.5%. So CPI is currently around 9.1. So you would anticipate that those things have got significantly worse since then, just 6 months on. We plan to actually rehash this level of polling as well, and we anticipate, as I say, it being much worse. However, what about hours? So again, there is two sides to this coin, and while pay is obviously important, so too are hours. So for example, we have a living hour standard, which looks at the amount of shift notice periods that people get, and also the extent to which, if those shifts are cancelled, they get paid properly. So unfortunately, there was no labour market data which could give us this information, so we launched our own sort of unique data set, which we continue to draw from. So what it finds is that, you know, almost half of low-paid workers that do variable hours or shift work get less than a week's notice for shifts, and less than a fifth, just under a fifth rather, get less than 24 hours. There's also a strong likelihood of workers that do shift work getting shifts cancelled unexpectedly, and the vast majority don't get proper payment as and when that does get cancelled. So this is something which really erodes financial resilience because, you know, particularly when it's intersected with low pay. If you think about if you kind of have budgeted for the amount of shifts that you consider that you're going to work in a month, and then next week you plan to work, say, 5 shifts and 3 get cancelled, obviously it creates a budgeting problem, but also your income is massively reduced. And if you're already on low pay, that can be super, super devastating. Now, in addition to the cuts to income, this also has quite a significant impact on costs. So insecure work is costly in the sense that there are actually premiums that people have to pay as a result of the way their hours are organized. So, for example, workers often report having to pay things like higher childcare and travel costs, or having to cancel social plans and occasions, which have ticketing costs as a result of the way their hours are organized. So you think about it, if you get called into work and you have an hour to get there, you then have to sort out emergency childcare, maybe you have to pay for a taxi. It's a lot more expensive than if you were to have that working hours organized enshrined. As I say, this impacts people across the income distribution. But if you look at, so for example, the left side of the graph just here, you'll see there's quite an even split between those paid less than the living wage and those paid above it. However, if you look at the right-hand side, what you see is that the impact is much higher for those that are paid less than the living wage. So they're much more likely to say that have the way that their hours organized mean that they face fluctuating social security payments, increased difficulty in financial planning and budgeting, and also a greater reliance on debt. And so being in low pay erodes financial resilience in and of itself, but when it's intersected with insecure work, it's just a real nightmare. So how does this impact financial resilience more broadly? So unsurprisingly, being on low pay, as I've said, means people are unable to build a savings buffer, and they remain to be in that precondition of wealth and asset building. So that's borne out in the pension data. So for example, the bottom 5 deciles in the UK account for less than 1% of all private pensions wealth. And also the pandemic has made this process worse in terms of the actual wealth inequalities. Because particularly during the onset of the pandemic, what we saw was that there was a lot of forced savings amongst those that were on better pay, who maintained their jobs, who worked from home, because there were so many sectoral lockdowns, people didn't have things to spend the money on. They could have savings instead. On the contrary, for those that were in low-paid or insecure work, they were either wanting to lose their jobs or be on the furlough scheme, and therefore had the complete opposite. They were increasingly reliant on credit and debt to meet their essentials. And as I say, I just want to kind of focus on also on like the level of expenditure, the kind of difference between those that are on low income and those that are on middle to high income. So what we find is that the proportion of low income people's expenditure on things like housing and food costs is much, much higher than the UK average. And that again, having to fork out so much of a portion of your income on essentials does mean that you're unable to get that savings buffer. And finally, just thinking about pensions more specifically. So pensions is a kind of new topic for us at the Living Wage Foundation, but obviously it's something that we are looking to get into a lot more. So research by the Centre for Ageing Better finds that a sharp rise in pensioner poverty since 2010, with almost 1 in 5 pensioners living in poverty. And so as such, we've also piloted a living pension standard, and what that aims to do is to find a gross amount which kind of would give people a decent standard of living into their retirement based on assumptions regarding things like income, housing, demographic shifts, et cetera, et cetera. So that proportion or amount that you need is then sort of converted into a percentage that you need to contribute throughout the career span. So initially, the assumption is that you'll start saving kind of at the very beginning of your career, but obviously we know that's not always the case, particularly for those on low income, and thus we've got a model which allows us to interpolate at different points, so assuming that people kind of start saving in pensions at different points in their career. So we also have a report which will go into a lot more detail than I have just now, and I would have loved for that report to have been released prior to this panel. Unfortunately, it was not. But yeah, some of the things that will be covered in that will be things like how successful auto-enrollment has been, and has there been an increase of those on low pay into have some degree of pension pot. Also, whether the auto-enrollment threshold of 8% is sufficient to meet the living pensions benchmark, what proportion of the UK workforce is currently on track to have a living pension, and also are there particular subsections of the population which are less likely to have that. So, for example, those that are more inclined to be in low pay, like women, people of colour, disabled workers, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that's given plenty for the panel to discuss later on. I will then hand over to Lindsay, and thanks ever so much.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks, Joanna, both really brilliant presentations. And hopefully mine is complimentary. It's quite interesting hearing about the States, actually, because I've got some perspectives from the UK. So I'm Lindsay Judge. I'm one of the research directors at the Resolution Foundation. I lead our housing work there. For those of you who don't know the foundation, we're an independent think tank, and we focus on living standards for those on low and middle income. And we do a lot of work on housing, a lot of work on wealth. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just share with you some of our analysis that we've done, and I've constrained myself to only 5 charts, which again, if anybody knows the Resolution Foundation will know, is spectacularly disciplined of me, but I want to use these 5 charts to sort of just tell you a story. And I think the first thing to say is that we talk a lot more about wealth and wealth inequalities today than we did even, I think, 5 years ago when I first started at the foundation, and certainly at the beginning of my career. It's become much more pertinent. People are much more aware of the importance for families for all the reasons that Joanna talked about. And we just, and of course there's, great kind of thinkers like Thomas Piketty who've really brought it to the fore. And I think there's this great sort of belief that wealth inequality has deteriorated over time. But actually, that isn't true. So I want to start with a very, very long view. So this chart goes right the way back to the 19th century, unbelievably. We never get data that goes back that far, so we're delighted by this. And this is showing you the share of net household wealth, so all household wealth, financial, pensions, housing, etc., that's held by the richest 1% and the richest 10% in the UK, Great Britain over time. And as you can see, the trajectory is kind of like downward, and very seriously downward. Now, that's not to say, of course, that the levels aren't still really quite shocking. So if you think that the top 10% are owning 50% of the wealth, the total wealth that's held in the UK today, that's pretty outrageous. And of course, when we look at the 1%, you see that they're owning 20% of the wealth. But overall, the kind of the story, the long-term story, is one of a broader sharing of wealth in the UK. And the number one reason for that is the sharing out of housing wealth. So what we see over time is a democratization of home ownership. And my second chart speaks to that. So This is I really love this chart actually, but it's a little bit tricky to explain, so let me be really kind of precise about what it's showing. So what it's showing you is where within the income distribution of each year sat the typical first-time buyer family. So it tells you something about how rich or how poor they were relative to other families from 1974 through to 2019. And you kind of probably don't need me to interpret this chart for you, but obviously what it's showing is that at the beginning of the period, the typical first-time buyer family was around about the 48th percentile in terms of the income distribution of their age cohort, I should say. And over time, that comes down. So in other words, home ownership became more and more accessible to those lower down the income distribution. So by the time we get to the mid-1990s, the typical first-time buyer was around about the 37th, 38th percentile. And then the trend reverses, and you get this kind of much more kind of, gradually home ownership becomes a much more kind of exclusive preserve once again. So we've gone through this kind of, again, long-term trajectory in terms of home ownership. And of course, the big question is, well, why have we? And you probably don't even need me to explain to you why, which is fundamentally what we saw over this period of time was rising incomes in that earlier period, especially relative to house prices. And we also saw liberalization of credit, which was really important because, as Joanna said, obviously there's, in terms of getting housing wealth, you take on debt in order to achieve that for the vast majority of people. I should also say there's a really, really, really big policy effect, and that is called right to buy. So what we saw in this middle period is fundamentally the government, of course, highly subsidizing a large number of people moving to home ownership, a one-off effect. And then we see a change in that trajectory. So in particular, we saw the separation of house prices from earnings. House prices began to run away much faster than earnings. And then coming out of the financial crisis, there was a kind of double whammy, which is we saw a restriction of credit, in particular for first-time buyers, as the macroprudential rules were tightened up. I mean, obviously, rightly so as a rule. So we see this kind of long-term trajectory, which I think is really interesting and sort of begs some really interesting questions for the future. I want to just think about the sort of the house price issue, and I want to do it through this slightly complicated chart, so I'm going to be really careful and slow about explaining what this is showing. So this is from a project we did which was really fascinating, where it was sort of basically a thought experiment. So we said, let's take the typical first-time buyer in each year from 1974 till 2019. And let's think through what their housing wealth would look like at the end of their first mortgage. So we imagined they stayed in that home and we ran them forward and we thought, what does it look like in terms of having, paid off the interest? What does it look like in terms of having got tax breaks for interest in this early period? And what does it look like in terms of their house price appreciation? So what we've done here is we've just aggregated them up into our generational bars to kind of like tell the story in a slightly more interesting way. And the first thing to sort of focus on is the solid bar. So the solid bar is what we call active wealth accumulation. And that is basically the money you have put into your house in the first place in terms of your deposit, and the money you then pay back on your mortgage, minus the interest you pay on it. And you can see that, in a sense, you kind of think, well, millennials, well, they're kind of really lucky because, if you get onto the home ownership ladder, you're looking at a very significant accumulation of wealth over the term of your first mortgage. The second thing to look at, which is where sort of millennials are less lucky, is the shaded part of the bar, the hatched part of the bar at the top. And what that shows you is what we call the passive wealth accumulation, which is essentially the wealth that you accumulate on your house by the end of your first mortgage term by virtue of house prices outpacing earnings. And there you can see that the kind of generational gift was fundamentally to the baby boomers and to the first birth cohort in Generation X. And you can see that passive accumulation is really significant. I mean, in some cases, it's more than half of the housing wealth you end up with. But this speaks to all kinds of dynamics in the housing wealth arena. I mean, it speaks to the fact that as house prices have got higher in terms of relationship to earnings, the gains are very significant, but the costs of being on the outside are kind of, well, let me put it another way. The costs of getting into that club have become much more challenging. And it also shows that over periods of time, some generations luck out in terms of whether they are holding housing wealth at periods of time when house prices are escalating very significantly. And of course, a really big question about whether the kind of trajectories we've seen on house prices are something that we would see into the future. So the kind of power that housing wealth has, which is demonstrated by the chart, which was driving that decline in wealth inequality overall over a period of time, is quite extreme. But of course, I mean, again, sort of moving on from this point that as house prices separated out from earnings, getting into the club became more and more challenging. And my fourth chart speaks to this, which is, I really like this chart again, because we often put up charts of home ownership rates, and they're often a bit boring, but this one sort of really speaks to people, I think, which is, this is showing you the home ownership rates. Again, we're only looking at the younger age cohort here, but it would look pretty much the same, albeit slightly different levels if we looked at total population. And this is broken out by occupational classes, so it speaks a lot to what you were just talking about, Joe. And you can see that for every occupational class, there has been a decline, a sort of structural decline in home ownership. But you don't need me to really interpret this for you, which is for managers and senior officials, for the most highest level professional grades, that has been quite muted. It's actually happened largely after the financial crisis, so it's largely a function of credit availability. And we've also seen a pickup in home ownership rates for this young cohort, and that is again largely driven by those in the highest occupational classes. Whereas for those in lower occupational classes, there has been this kind of falling away of youth home ownership and ability to access home ownership, and hence ability to build up housing wealth, which is really quite extreme, and as you can see is not yet in anything like recovery. So you get this kind of wedge, you get a much bigger sort of sense of the insider-outsider. And that if I hadn't disciplined myself with 5 charts, I would have put another chart in here, which is that dynamic is very, very much exacerbated by intergenerational wealth transmission. So in particular, we've always known that it's easier to get on the housing ladder if your parents can help you. That's been true across time. But we know that effect has got stronger, and this chart, I think, sort of speaks to that too. And then my final chart is one which I'm going to build up slowly, and it's kind of, I've talked a lot about different thought experiments we've done and different sort of ways we've sort of played around with data to try and animate our understanding and sort of unpack an understanding of what's driven the kind of rise and fall of housing wealth, if you like, over time, and which types of groups are particularly excluded from assessing, what's the word I'm looking for? Accumulating housing wealth, that's the word I'm looking for. And this is a piece of work we did last year, which was actually looking at the data and looking at people's wealth and ability to enter home ownership. So what we did here was the following, which is we're thinking here about non-homeowners. So our cohort is renters at this point in time. And what we thought was, well, in order to enter home ownership, you need to have 2 things. You need to have savings in order to pay for your down payment, and you need to have an income that allows you to service your mortgage. And of course, those are highly regulated coming out of the financial crisis. So this is a kind of grid where we're sort of, what we've marked on here is the lines which show you the typical deposit required to buy the first-time buyer house, average first-time buyer house in the UK, GB, and the typical earnings you'd require in order to service the mortgage. And then what we can do with this is we can drop in, I don't think you can see that, there's lots of little grey dots, but I will mark them off in a sec. We drop in the actual data from the Wealth and Asset Survey. So we can see in there, we can see people's earnings and we can see people's savings, and we drop them in and put people into these quadrants. And this is what we found, which is 4% of this population that we were looking at had sufficient earnings and savings to buy the average first-time buyer house in their region. Now we've slightly changed the underlying mechanics here. To which I think, it's fair to conclude that if you have the money, you go out and buy a house. And when you see those figures on appreciation, I think it's completely understandable. And when you think about what the options are in the private rented sector in terms of stability and quality, then it would be almost a no-brainer not to do that. If you look at the 2 sort of on the diagonal here, where sufficient savings but your earnings aren't sufficient, and sufficient earnings but your savings are too low, you can see that the bigger challenge there is the deposit. So it's quite unusual to not have sufficient earnings to be able to service a mortgage but have sufficient savings. But it is not that unusual to have not enough savings. But of course the real standout on this chart is the 80%, 4 out of 5 of this young cohort that we were looking at, who have neither the earnings or savings. They're both too low. And I think what was really fascinating here, and I'm not sure it's quite shows up because the dots don't come out, is when we did this exercise, what we thought we'd do is we would play around with the sort of assumptions we'd put in here in terms of like how much smaller your deposit could be, or what would happen if you saved at a faster rate. And we thought what we'd be able to do is basically move people beyond this possibility frontier into this top category. Well, the bottom line is you can't really do that. So the various scenarios we tried didn't work because fundamentally so few people have anything that like a significant amount of savings that would get them even close to that home ownership frontier. So kind of to sort of summarize, I mean, I think what a kind of long-term look tells us is housing wealth is incredibly important. I mean, homes are of course important for a whole set of reasons, but they've been so important historically in terms of building up and accumulating wealth, both actively but importantly passively as well. But the challenges for young people today, and particularly for those on low middle incomes, are very, very significant. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of the panelists. I have to say I've been really looking forward to this panel ever since we kind of came up with the idea, because I thought it would be very thought-provoking, and I am still of the view that it was extremely thought-provoking. I hope others in the room felt that way as well. I feel like we could have given each of you an hour, and then a whole other hour for me to chat to you, and then probably a whole other hour for the audience here and streaming at home to chat. But I will take at least one or two questions myself, if that's okay, and then I will hand over to the room. So I guess my first question is, look, if you look at the framework, this is a question to all of you, if you look at the framework, Joanna, that you laid out, it's kind of bewilderingly massive and complicated. And we've touched on one bit of your precondition and one asset class in this session, and that leaves a whole load of that picture untouched. And we sort of know in the public policy space that there have been certain times where a really ruthless focus on one topic, like universal access to retirement saving, or increasingly, I think in the UK, beginnings of more of a focus on emergency saving, you can make real progress. But how do you make progress against the whole picture? What are the sort of mechanisms for doing that, or is it even right to try? Or should we actually kind of try and leave this to the individual specialists in the individual areas and sort of hope that we make incremental progress, kind of one topic at a time? And maybe Joanna, I'll start with you, and then welcome views from Joe and Lindsay as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So I'm sad you think it's complicated, because that's our most simplified version. Because this is actually quite complicated. I mean, to your point, I'm sort of joking here. Part of why we build these frameworks at Aspen, because we are really in the business of leadership, is that precisely what you said, that kind of all the things have to happen. It's to use a drinking metaphor, it's like we need the perfect cocktail, because all the things interact in a way that either work really well for working families or insufficient because they're not all happening at the same time for them. So our goal is to not say just focus on housing, or just focus on retirement, or just focus on emergency savings or something. And the reason that slide I chose, I love that you were like, I only did 5. I also had to be like, what are the essential slides? The one that has all the icons of what people's portfolios look like is because the richest people in our country have all the things. You need a mixed portfolio. I don't expect everyone to get up to like the 1% that has 50% of our wealth, but we need to make some progress towards it. And we know that works in the US. So we actually do need leaders in all of those sectors to say, I get the interactions matter. I am a leader in the retirement space. And so when I go to our 101 inclusive solutions, or our whole retirement portfolio, or look at the work that you guys are doing here, which we've been really inspired about in the US, what is my thing to do as like the head of Prudential? It is really the answer. And so it's not simple work. And we expect that it takes time, and it's big tent stakeholder building.
Great, thanks. And Joe?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at a systematic way of kind of pulling people into a point at which they can start making savings or making assets, I think you have to look at the labor market and kind of particularly the bottom end. So as I showed on my slides, I mean, there are some people that are in work, and having a savings buffer is a pipe dream, because they're still cutting back on essentials, they're still kind of foregoing things like food and all kind of catastrophic things. So I think if we can sort of address that, that will help a large section of those in the lowest income decile get to a point at which they can save not necessarily to, as I said, to Joanna's point, to get to the 1%, but can save and have that buffer and get to a level of comfortability when they're doing it. So as I say, I think we've seen kind of with the growth of insecure and casualized work after the financial crisis, that work has become something which isn't necessarily a conduit out of poverty. So the growth of in-work poverty has been quite marked over the past 10 years. I think the most recent IPPR analysis found it to be around 17%. And I would imagine, given the way that the cost of living crisis has happened, that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I think addressing things like low-paid, casualized, and insecure work and giving people that solid, stable, predictable income will be really important.
Great, thanks. And Lindsay?
Well, I would definitely second what you just said about in-work poverty. We've looked at that a lot, and that it's really shocking, actually. I mean, I'm going to give you a very big macro answer, which is sort of like simple, but also, of course, incredibly complicated. So I think I would point to two things, which is, I mean, fundamentally, this is about inadequate incomes. It goes back to the labour market point, and it's also about the intergenerational transmission of wealth and the concentration of wealth. So, I mean, on the first, I think you've just got to recognise we had an absolutely dismal decade and a bit of income growth in the UK, and fundamentally that's about productivity. So you have to look kind of, every time you find an answer, you look further and further and further back, but it is about productivity, and we really have to do something to fix that, because without that we are not going to get the pay growth. But we also have to fix the distribution issues, which Joe's already alluded to, and I think in particular one of the things that we've done a lot of work on at the foundation is around pay progression. And we know that people get stuck in low pay, no pay situations, and we have to find solutions to that, and that looks like something like training and re-education, and we also have to think about adequacy of benefits. I mean, it's always really humbling when you hear about the States. You think we shouldn't be complaining about benefits in the UK, but we do complain about benefits in the UK, and we should. And then the other thing on adequate incomes to think about, which goes back to housing, is, of course, if you're in this home ownership club, especially in a period of low interest rates, and even though they're going up a little bit, we're still in a period of low interest rates, your housing costs are really quite low. If you're a renter in the UK, especially in the private renter sector, you're spending on average more than a third of your income on your housing costs. So, how on earth are people able to save with those kinds of housing cost pressures? So that's my first thing on inadequate incomes. And my second thing on the intergenerational transmission of wealth is, we just have to get really serious about wealth taxation, I think, in this country.
Okay. I really want to ask you some more questions, but I'm going to go to the audience in the room and online to see what questions or comments people might have, and then if I can, I'll maybe come back to some of mine afterwards. So I think, Jonathan?
Thanks for, again, a really interesting set of presentations. Question, I think, perhaps for you, Joanne. You mentioned retirement wealth draining, which I believe is probably the ability to dip into your retirement account, which I think is allowable in the States. This sometimes comes up as a sort of public policy kind of hotspot occasionally, particularly during cost of living crisis. I'd just be interested in your experiences as to whether you broadly think that's a good thing or not.
Yeah, so Michelle and I were actually just talking about this before the panel. In the US, you can go into your retirement account. There are some purposes under which you are allowed, and sometimes under which you just do it, and then sometimes it's taxable, sometimes it's, it's all kinds of things to try to dissuade you from doing it, but yet drainage happens all the time. Technically speaking, like from a how money works standpoint, you should never do it, because you need it to sit there, and that's how it grows, and that's how you have sufficiency when you're older. Where it maybe works the best, and this is still me saying, please don't do it, is potentially around an asset purchase, right? Borrowing out of it for homeownership, for example, where that asset is expected to appreciate in a way that won't match the market, but is actually really good and important and part of diversifying your portfolio. And homes are a big part of intergenerational wealth, and then you leverage it in the US anyways to pay for college. Often people are taking out second mortgages, or they're at least, co-signing onto loans because they have this big asset. So owning a home, as Lindsay keeps saying, is like so central to how you manage your own financial risk over your lifetime in the US, that it's a thing that needs to happen if you're ever going to really be financially secure. So that might be like the rare condition, short of like huge medical issue, which again is very US specific about the way we do our healthcare. If like no one's gonna pay for you to get cancer treatments, I'm not sure what you do truly. That's like grim and awful, and that's the shameful way our country operates. But in terms of what would be a positive use, that's the best I could come up with. But I don't know that it's particularly great policy that we allow for it.
So I'm actually just going to pass a version of that question with an addendum to Lindsay, because I'd just be interested. This came up in an event last week where the Association of British Insurers were talking about some future policy questions, and one of the people presenting there was talking about, should we actually be helping people to sequence saving for a home and then saving for retirement, even though kind of that's counterintuitive to people on the retirement side who think of investing money early as the most powerful way to invest money. But so I'd be really interested in your views on, in some way, shape or form, tapping into the progress we've made on creating a retirement savings habit to address the home ownership issue. And within that, maybe any thoughts you have on demand side versus supply side interventions on the housing front, because clearly that would be a demand stimulation intervention, and just welcome your views on that.
That's like 3 questions in one, isn't it? On the housing wealth versus pensions wealth, I mean, as Joanna said, obviously the value of your pension is very contingent on how long it's been sitting there and accumulating, and you can understand why people might think that housing first is a good strategy. I think it probably is a good strategy in the sense that if you could project forward house prices. So do we think house prices are going to continue to run away from earnings? Well, there has to come a point when they don't any longer. And if you look at Office of Budget Responsibility projections on the economy, they consistently expect house prices to start to return to form and just follow earnings. So, the gains that we've seen and that I showed in the charts are not for surefire. And I think that people often make a lot of housing decisions, and perhaps possibly bad housing decisions, on the assumption that they will always look like that. When we look at the data, housing wealth and pensions wealth is highly correlated. So in other words, people who've got quite a lot of housing wealth tend to have quite a lot of pensions wealth. And so it does seem to suggest that they're not sort of substitutable fundamentally. And I think if I remember my behavioral economics well, that's definitely what's been shown from studies in the States. It's if you can get people, auto-enrollment is such an amazing policy intervention because it has tackled so much of the inadequacy that we knew and still would exist within pension system for different cohorts. But it doesn't appear to have affected people's ability to buy homes. It will at the margin, but fundamentally that substitutability isn't a really big thing. Do you want me to take the issue of housing demand versus supply? Yeah. That's a really challenging one. Fundamentally, in order for those charts again that I showed you to change, the relationship between house prices and earnings has got to change. And some of that will be earnings growth and productivity, as I've just talked about, and some of it will be about housing costs kind of recalibrating. And in order to do that, some people will say, build your way out of the crisis. Well, building has got to be part of it. Supply has got to be part of it. But Kate Barker showed in her review in 2004, so a long time ago now, that in order to get out of a crisis by building, you have to build absolutely huge amounts of units, and we are not going to get there. Fundamentally, we're not. So you have to recognize that there needs to be other interventions, and I think you have to look at ways of damping down demand for housing. And again, the place you look to that is to taxation. We tax housing wealth really badly in the UK, where our council tax is incredibly regressive and incredibly out of date, and we don't tax. We don't have capital gains tax on main residences. But I just showed you what those capital gains look like. That is there for the taking fundamentally.
Yeah, and of course the challenge of projecting forward the value of housing as an asset is also true of projecting forward the value of other asset classes in the wealth building space, right? Capital markets, for example, being a kind of really good case in point. Okay, so back to the room or to the audience online. I think we've got 2 questions on the table at the front. So lady behind first, and then Pete second.
Hi, my name is Anna Mowbray. I'm Research and Policy Officer at Community Union. I wanted to ask, so Joe, you spoke about your retirement living standards, and you suggested that you'll be including whether or not people are homeowners or not as part of that. And I think given that what Lindsay's pointed out about the fact that renting is significantly more expensive than paying a mortgage, and obviously if you've got a paid off mortgage, even less. And I just wondered what your guys' thoughts were on the implications for poverty and retirement of obviously the increasing unaffordability of housing.
Yeah, well, that's sort of factored into the calculation in that, you know, the assumption with the living pensions threshold is no longer that, you know, every pensioner will automatically own a home into their retirement, just because, as you say, that lack of access to the housing market and that increasing unaffordability, particularly of people that, you know, are on low incomes, is no longer a given. And even if housing prices do return to form, as you say, it's still no guarantee. So that's definitely factored in. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? Sorry, I've completely forgotten.
So about poverty in retirement based on whether someone is a homeowner or not, and what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, well, absolutely, you would anticipate there being a large gulf between those that are homeowners and those that aren't, just because, as I say, the resale value of a house is absolutely astronomical compared to the actual cost that you're going to get if you're going to rent it, or if you're going to be renting, rather. And also, I think that if you look at the decade of real wage growth, or lack of real wage growth, I think if today's wage crisis, tomorrow's pension crisis, right? Because you can only have enough of your pension in, you know, that's factored into your wage, sort of thing. So absolutely, I think you may see increasing gulfs between mortgage owners and non-mortgage owners, yes, but also those that were on high incomes throughout their career and those that weren't.
Yeah, please.
Just really quickly, I mean, is this working? It is. I mean, the question about housing costs in retirement is a really interesting one. And we've done some really interesting work where we've taken where we are on home ownership and rolled it forward and thought about, you know, what would those housing costs look like for the young people today if they never got on the housing ladder, and it's staggering. But a really important point is the state picks up a huge amount of that because pensioners would get housing benefit. So in a sense, it's more of a problem for the state than it is for those individuals. I think the biggest question really, if you're still renting in retirement, is security, and that is a real problem.
Yeah, and of course we know that historically a lot of the ways of measuring retirement income adequacy sort of assume away housing, right? So the Pensions Commission did it. They said, well, we'll just assume people have kind of owned their houses outright by the time they retire. And I think the early versions of the retirement income standard work that the PLSA have done as well, although I know they're now sort of starting to build in housing costs. I think it's sort of interesting to see how much we simply assume, probably because of the peak of home ownership that you showed on your chart, that we can sort of somehow assume that most people won't be renting in retirement, therefore we don't have to factor into the design of the retirement system, whereas maybe that's rather less true these days. Pete?
Is that on? Yeah, okay, thanks. It's just building on that point. I mean, I think work that we did at Scottish Widows was suggesting that the average rent around the country is around about 40% of the average pension income. You know, so if you don't own your own home outright, when you retire, a large part of your pension that you've saved up for is going to go away on rental costs, notwithstanding that some of that will be benefits. But we're seeing an increasing trend as well, you know, towards people having lifetime mortgages. So it's not just rent. House prices are getting to the point that they're so high that people are taking out mortgages that are running right through their retirement. So you could see a substantial amount of your pension income going away on a mortgage. And do we need to be engaging people more earlier in their working lives to be getting them to think about, am I going to target having no substantial housing costs by about the age of 60 and 65? And that might affect how much you pay for a house. You know, you might want to get a mortgage or a house that you can afford to pay off by the time you get to retirement. But it doesn't seem to me we're having those conversations with people about the importance of home ownership at retirement, and maybe we should be. I don't know. Does the panel have thoughts on that?
One thing, I mean, I will let the people that are here answer that about what that means here. I mean, part of what I take from Lindsay's and Joe's presentation is that it just may not be a choice in terms of what housing prices are and how long you need to stretch out your mortgage so that you can afford any of it. I think that's more and more where the country is likely headed, or at least for now, while the housing prices stay where they are, but you all should be accurate about it. Related to people going into their retirement age with mortgages, though, in the US, we're seeing a steep increase in just other debt when they're in retirement age. So most of the predictors about what you need for when you retire assume no housing payment, housing upkeep, but no payment and taxes, and presume no other debt. But we're seeing increased retirement with all kinds of debt, including student loan debt that they took on for their children. We will now see with this middle generation, people who are probably sitting on their own debt when they are actually retiring, which is even more shameful and frightening. And of course, medical debt in our country, which is not the same here, but maybe turning that way, you know, depending on where your NHS system goes. So that is super frightening from what is then the actual sufficient amount to retire on, and can you even make it there given all the stuff that Joe and Lindsay have been talking about?
Any follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, just a brief follow-up. I mean, the analytical exercise we did that I showed you, where we took the average first-time buyer and kind of rolled them forward. The rationale for doing that, or the impetus for doing that, was because we were recognizing that so many people were entering home ownership only by having very, very long mortgage terms, and actually, it does make a difference, but the impact of that is tiny, actually. The thing that is overwhelmingly kind of crushing and difficult is the deposit barrier and the house price and the mortgage you have to pay off. So it is material, and it's definitely material to individuals who are in that situation in retirement. I think I would imagine lots of people do that, they have that kind of behavior because they just have this expectation that house prices will continue to increase. And if I can resort to anecdote, I quite often tell this anecdote, so maybe people in the room have heard me tell it, which is a couple of years ago I sat on something called the Affordable Homes Commission, and as part of that we ran some qualitative focus groups with private renters who were sort of on the cusp of home ownership. So they were, there was a realistic prospect that they were going to become homeowners. And one of the questions in the group was, do you want house prices to rise or fall? And everybody said rise. And it was absolutely extraordinary. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas. And the reason why they said that was because they thought, once I'm in the club, I want those returns that I've seen other people have. And so I think that there's definitely, if we're thinking about sort of education, I think there's definitely education that needs to be done to kind of temper people's expectations about what the returns are likely to be on housing wealth in the future.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the streaming audience. I'm going to start with, has any country that we know of between us on the panel, or indeed anyone in the audience here, has any country kind of got this right? What are the models that we could look at elsewhere around kind of wealth building? Joanna?
Oh my gosh, I mean, not mine. I don't know. I mean, I think countries, what we should be looking at, possibly, one way to approach this is countries who have a stronger social contract with individuals. And so, like in the US, you literally don't expect to get pretty much anything from the government, maybe Social Security, but even now, who knows if it'll be there for me. And so all of the risk is on myself. I need to have enough money for my lifetime to do all the things I want to do and all the things I have to do. And there are other countries, and I would think of the UK in this bucket, although I don't know, hearing everyone talk, I'm not sure if I should, but there are countries that are even sort of more socialized than the UK, where the amount of wealth an individual needs is much less because so much is given to you, through taxes and your payments, but the values of the country say something different, it's a whole different culture than the US, right? So I don't know if they've gotten it right, but actually the amount a single person, like a household, needs to have is wildly different because of what the country gives you and you can rely on.
So I'm going to, in the UK, if we're not sure what to do about social policy, we look at Sweden, always. And we have our resident Swede in the room, Stefan. You and I have talked a bit about some of this cultural stuff before. Do you have any kind of comment on that?
Sweden and Denmark and Netherlands have probably the highest taxes in the world. They also have the happiest people in the world. And I think doing things collectively as a society, as a country, it allows you to solve some of the problems, particularly healthcare at older age. You cannot self-insure that. It's very good to insure it across the broadest population you have, that's your country. So I think there are a couple of things you can do quite cleverly. You don't have to be a socialist. Oh, I thought it would work. But one question I have, actually, when I'm saw the data for the US, I love your optimism, by the way, but if the system doesn't work for 60-70% of the population, are we not running a risk that democracy will stop working as well?
Yes, that is the way at the Financial Security Program we are trying to make this problem more urgent, is to, through evidence and through culture and values, show the deep connection between our wealth inequality, our financial insecurity in the country, and the lack of essentially a functioning democracy we have right now. But you are 100% right.
Any more questions in the room? If not, I'm going to offer each of you a choice of 2 questions to close out. So you can either answer, what are the causes for optimism? What do you feel hopeful about in this space? Or you can answer, if you had a magic wand and could wave it for one policy intervention that you think would help in either your own area or the broader area of wealth building, what would it be? So, Lindsay, perhaps I'll start with you. You can either tell us why we should be optimistic in this space, or what you would do from an intervention sense to change things.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning, which is we're talking about wealth, right? And we're talking about wealth inequality. And we recognize all those things that you had on your slide, Joanna, about, which isn't just about, it's not about money, it's about security and well-being and democracy and all of, this is a really important topic. So I just think the fact that it's very high up the agenda is something to be really hopeful for, and we're just much more alert to it than we were in the past. I mean, in terms of, and what one would hope that would lead to is policy intervention, and I would again just point to taxation on that. I mean, we know that there's charts you can draw that show how housing wealth and other types of wealth have increased in value, so dramatically over time, and you can look at the wealth tax line and it's completely flat. And just, even a little adjustment on that would be a serious kind of correction. It would put money into the exchequer for redistribution, and it would also damp down demand for certain products like housing. So I think that there is stuff to be hopeful for, but wealth taxation is politically quite a hot potato.
Great, thanks. And Joe?
In terms of something I would be slightly more optimistic about, I would say we actually might get the employment bill sometime soon. So we've had about 1,000 reviews of the world of work. They all say the same thing. Workers got increasingly insecure, real wage growth has been fairly flat, if not negative, and everything is pretty damn rubbish, basically. So I would hope to see that coming in soon, albeit, I mean, with the political chaos that's going on at the moment, it may be pushed down the line even further. But nevertheless, if we do have that review of work and can actually make systematic improvements to the labour market, I think that would be a really positive step.
Great, and last word, Joanna.
So I am an annoyingly optimistic person. So I wouldn't do this work every day if I didn't actually think we can make progress. And where we see progress on our side is actually real, I think, genuine private sector interest, both in terms of what is their role, what do they need to be doing, but also where can they use their influence on policy change. That's the only way that'll happen in the US. We have a deeply dysfunctional government, as everyone here knows, and it has to, I think it needs to be outsider pressure in, and I don't think it'll be sufficient just from grassroots. The one other thing that I actually really think we have to do in the US is we need to have Medicare for all. Like, we need that is such a driver of problems in the US when you think about, when I look at other countries and think about what they have, even as imperfect as it is, without healthcare for everyone that is sufficient and good, and thinking about your point, like, that's just fundamentally, we're never gonna make huge progress on wealth and wealth equality.
Great. Look, thank you to the panel. That's been unbelievably interesting. And so please, if we could all just thank the panel. Okay, so I just have a couple of sort of final closing remarks, and then I'm going to ask Claire Chamberlain from BlackRock to come up and close the event, and then hopefully you will stay with us and have a drink and a bit of food afterwards. So the first thing is we asked you a couple of Slido questions during the day, and I'm hoping that the results of those are going to come up shortly. So in the context of the current cost of living challenges, would you rather see employers focusing any additional financial wellbeing budget on supporting longer-term financial security, immediate and short-term issues, or a combination of the two? Well, lesson for us here, never give people three options with one that's obviously in the middle. Bad behavioural economics on our part, but perhaps not surprisingly, generally a view that there's scope for a combination of both things. The second question. Okay, so which inequalities or solutions around supporting wealth building for low and moderate income groups do you think require the most research and innovation? So we're seeing financial resilience and emergency saving and housing wealth as the top two there, and security of work as well. So, and I would suspect that retirement wealth is low on the list, in spite of this being a largely retirement sort of policy-focused audience, in part because it's an area that we all feel we've made real progress on, and so we can perhaps sort of think about some of these issues now increasingly alongside or ahead of retirement directly. But I think that's a really interesting finding. So, look, we asked these questions in the room for two reasons, right? One is because it's good to have a bit of interactivity in the room. It's interesting to hear kind of how people are reacting to the topics that we're talking about. But the other is that we, Nest Insight, are kind of always thinking about our future work program and where do we want to direct our attention. You know, we are trying to populate these debates with evidence. We're trying to do that with high quality research, and it's really helpful to us to hear from people what are the research topics and the priorities and the areas of focus that they are most interested in. So we're going to take these away and think about them in that context. And on that note, we've got a third question, which I'm just going to ask to go up on the screen now, which is an open question. What research would you like to see Nest Insight undertake around financial security in the future? So if you get a chance, you don't have to do it right now, but if you get a chance, that question is going to be live on Slido for a little bit. We would like to hear your views on that, and we are actually going to be going out and talking to a number of people over the next few months to sort of try and gather views on this as well, both to inform our future work programme and specifically on this whole topic of wealth building. So many of you can expect to hear from us in that context in the near term. Okay, so just a couple of final comments from me. Firstly, I hope everyone's found today as interesting and stimulating as I have. I think there's been some really interesting and provocative discussion, so that's been great. You can find more information about the work that we're doing in this space at the Nest Insight website, and if you want to know any more, please do get in touch, insight@nestcorporation.org.uk. We'd love to hear from you to talk more about what we're doing or to talk about ways in which we might work together. Next thing for me to do is just to reiterate a couple of thank yous. So I want to thank the venue. I think many people have said it's a really beautiful place to hold an event. I think it's been great, so thank you to everyone at the venue. Thank you again in particular to the Nest Insight team, everyone who's been involved, and the wider Nest team who volunteered to help today in a whole variety of ways. Thank you to our speakers and panelists. I think have done a great job, and certainly all the discussions I've been involved in the breaks and at lunch have suggested that people have found those to be really interesting. And finally, thank you again to our partners, particularly our strategic partners, BlackRock and Invesco, without whose support we wouldn't be able to do any of these things, any of the work that we're doing or any of these kinds of events, which is a good basis on which to hand over to Claire Chamberlain, who is the co-head of Global Social Impact at BlackRock, who's just going to say a few words to finish us off. So, Claire, over to you.
Well done. That's been a terrific day. I was only able to join sort of right before lunchtime. Gemma Gooch, who I co-head Social Impact at BlackRock with, is based in London. I'm based in New York. Gemma was here for the morning session, and I know she found it to be particularly interesting. And frankly, it's deeply satisfying as a funder to witness a gathering like this and to listen and learn and have a real-time appreciation for the importance of the challenge at hand and the number of actors across sectors that need to mobilize to address that challenge. It's multidimensional. It's long duration. The facets of it change with time, as the pandemic, by example, has demonstrated recently. And we at BlackRock, at Social Impact, which is the firm's philanthropic effort, we have for the last couple of years seen the opportunity in that challenge and have wanted to really explore with influential thought partners like Nest to explore what solutions can look like and how can we help people during their lifetime as well as at the end of their lifetime, but how can we help people create greater financial security and stability, which we know, I don't have to tell this group, we know are absolutely cornerstone to successful, productive lives and frankly to successful societies. That's been mentioned on numerous occasions here today. So knowing that I stand between you all and a glass of wine or a beer, I'm going to keep this really short and just say thank you to Will and the entire Nest team, some of whom are here today, others of whom have worked behind the scenes as the team does. I also want to thank each of the panelists, our keynote, our moderators, and everybody who has come to listen and participate with questions. And also the people who are watching virtually. It truly takes a village, and we're all part of that. So thank you very much.
Okay, that's it. So there should be drinks and nibbles back in the refreshment room. I hope some of you will stay and take the opportunity to chat a bit more about what we've talked about today and have a drink with us. Thanks very much.